A devoted secretary who had worked for 8 loyal years serving a powerful billionaire was suddenly accused of stealing $2 million from his company. She was dragged into court without a lawyer, destroyed in the headlines, and left completely alone against the weight of corporate power and unlimited resources. Everyone believed she was guilty because the word of a billionaire and his polished legal team carried more weight than her trembling voice and her innocence. But in the middle of the trial, when it seemed that nothing could save her from public ruin, the unexpected happened. The billionaire's ex-wife, a woman who had disappeared from his life years ago, walked through those courtroom doors and revealed evidence so explosive it shattered the entire prosecution, exposing lies that reached far beyond one stolen account. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get into the story. We love to know that Edna Hyde had worked for Wallace Thompson for many years. Every day she managed the confidential files of his billion-dollar empire, coordinated high-stakes meetings, handled sensitive contracts, and made sure everything in Thompson Enterprises ran like clockwork. She was professional, discreet, and deeply trusted by everyone in the company. Over the years, she became more than just an employee. She was the person Wallace relied on when deals went south, when investors got nervous, when his public image needed protecting. Edna was loyal to a fault, and she believed that loyalty would be returned. Wallace Thompson was a man who had built his empire on precision, control, and an unshakable public reputation. He was respected, feared, and always 10 steps ahead of his competitors. But behind the polished boardrooms and magazine covers, Wallace had grown distant over the years, colder, more calculating. His world was one of power moves and strategic alliances, and recently he had hired a new lawyer, Karen Blankenship, a woman known for her ruthlessness and her ability to make problems disappear. Karen didn't like Edna from the beginning. She saw her as too close to Wallace, too knowledgeable about the inner workings of the company. Over time, Karen began restricting Edna's access to certain files, redirecting her emails, slowly isolating her from the center of power. Edna noticed the changes but said nothing. She trusted Wallace. She believed he would see through whatever game Karen was playing. Then one day everything collapsed. An internal audit revealed that $2 million had been transferred from Thompson Enterprises' offshore accounts to an anonymous foreign account. The transfer bore Edna's digital signature, her authorization codes, her access credentials. Karen wasted no time. She called a press conference and publicly accused Edna of embezzlement, painting her as a manipulative woman who had abused her position and betrayed the man who trusted her most. The media storm was immediate and brutal. Within hours, Edna's face was on every news site, every headline screaming the same story. Secretary steals millions from billionaire employer. Reporters camped outside her apartment. Former colleagues refused to take her calls. Her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation, leaving her with nothing. Edna tried to explain that she would never do such a thing. She begged Wallace to look at the records again, to see that something was wrong, that someone had used her credentials without her knowledge. But Wallace wouldn't meet her eyes. Standing beside Karen in his corner office, he told Edna that she had to leave the company immediately. Security escorted her out while employees whispered and filmed on their phones. She felt the weight of their stares, the judgment, the betrayal. At the police station, Edna sat in a cold interrogation room while officers asked her questions she couldn't answer. They didn't arrest her, but they made it clear she was their primary suspect. She was told she would have to appear in court soon. She had no lawyer, no money to hire one, and no one willing to stand beside her. The legal aid office gave her the contact information for a young intern with limited experience, but even he seemed doubtful about her chances. Edna returned to her small apartment and collapsed. She cried for hours, not just because of the accusation or the frozen accounts or even the looming trial. She cried because after 8 years of dedication, of late nights and early mornings, of protecting Wallace's secrets and covering his mistakes, he had looked at her like she was nothing, like she had never mattered at all. The worst part was knowing that the world had already decided she was guilty. In the court of public opinion, a black secretary standing accused by a white billionaire didn't stand a chance. In a system built on power and wealth, her word meant nothing. But Edna Hyde hadn't always stood in courtrooms fighting for her life. There was a time not so long ago when she believed that hard work and loyalty could protect you. That if you kept your head down, did your job well, and treated people with respect, the world would treat you fairly in return. She had learned that lesson from her mother. Kendra Hyde had been a janitor. Not the kind of job people remembered or celebrated. Not the kind of work that came with business cards or corner offices or retirement parties where colleagues gave speeches about your contributions. Kendra cleaned office buildings in the financial district, the same glittering towers where men like Wallace Thompson made decisions that moved markets and changed lives. She mopped their floors, emptied their trash bins, wiped down their marble countertops, and made sure everything looked perfect before they arrived each morning. She worked the night shift. Always the night shift. Edna remembered those years with a clarity that still made her chest tighten. She remembered waking up in the middle of the night as a child and finding her mother's side of the bed already cold. Kendra would leave their small apartment at 10 in the evening and wouldn't return until 6 in the morning, her uniform smelling of industrial cleaner and exhaustion. Edna remembered those years with a clarity that still made her chest tighten. She remembered waking up in the middle of the night as a child and finding her mother's side of the bed already cold. Kendra would leave their small apartment at 10 in the evening and wouldn't return until 6 in the morning, her uniform smelling of industrial cleaner and exhaustion. She'd come home, make Edna breakfast, walk her to school, and then collapse into bed for a few hours before starting the cycle again. It had been that way ever since Edna's father died. Marcus Hyde had been a construction worker, a man with strong hands and an even stronger laugh. Edna barely remembered him now, just fragments, really. The way he used to lift her onto his shoulders. The sound of his voice singing old gospel songs on Sunday mornings. The warmth of his hugs. He had died in an accident on a job site when Edna was only 7 years old. One moment he was there, solid and real and permanent. The next moment, he was gone. The compensation from the company had been insulting. A small payout that barely covered the funeral costs and 2 months of rent. After that, Kendra was on her own with a young daughter and bills that never stopped coming. She could have broken under that weight. Many people did. But Kendra Hyde had been made of something stronger than circumstance. "We don't beg and we don't steal," she used to tell Edna, her voice firm but never harsh. "We work. We work harder than anyone expects us to, and we hold our heads high while we do it. You hear me, baby?" Edna heard her. She always heard her. Kendra took the night janitor job because it paid slightly more than day shifts, and because it meant she could still be present for Edna during the most important hours. Morning drop-offs at school, evening homework sessions, Sunday church services. She sacrificed sleep, sacrificed her health, sacrificed any semblance of a social life, all to make sure her daughter never felt the full weight of their poverty. But Edna felt it anyway. She felt it every time she wore the same 3 outfits to school on rotation while other girls showed up in new clothes each week. She felt it when her classmates talked about family vacations to Disney World and she stayed quiet because their idea of a vacation was visiting her aunt across town. She felt it during the school fundraisers when she had to explain that her mother couldn't afford to buy anything from the catalog, her cheeks burning with shame as the teacher nodded sympathetically. The hardest part wasn't the lack of money, though. It was watching her mother disappear piece by piece. Kendra developed a persistent cough that she refused to see a doctor about because she couldn't afford to miss work. Her hands became dry and cracked from the harsh chemicals she used every night, the skin splitting open in painful fissures that she wrapped in bandages and ignored. She lost weight because she made sure Edna ate well even when it meant she went without. Dark circles settled permanently beneath her eyes, shadows that no amount of rest seemed to erase. "Mama, you should stay home tonight," Edna would say sometimes, watching her mother move slowly around their tiny kitchen, her exhaustion visible in every gesture. "Can't, baby," Kendra would reply, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Bills don't pay themselves." But despite everything, despite the bone-deep tiredness, despite the financial stress that never eased, despite the invisibility of her work, Kendra never lost her dignity. She wore her uniform with pride. She greeted people with genuine warmth. She taught Edna that there was honor in every kind of honest work, that cleaning toilets was no less valuable than signing contracts in boardrooms, even if the world pretended otherwise. "Don't ever let anyone make you feel small because of what you do," Kendra told her daughter more than once. Every job that needs doing deserves respect. Every person working hard deserves respect. You remember that. Edna remembered. She also remembered the whispers. Their neighborhood was small and tight-knit, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where gossip spread faster than news, where unusual things didn't stay hidden for long. And Edna had always been unusual. It started small. Mrs. Patterson from downstairs mentioned that when Edna had helped her carry groceries one afternoon, the arthritis pain in her hands had eased for the first time in weeks. Mr. Chen from the corner store swore that after Edna touched his shoulder while reaching for something on a high shelf, the chronic back pain he'd suffered from for years simply vanished. Young Marcus Jr., who lived 2 doors down, claimed that when Edna hugged him after he fell off his bike, the scrapes on his knees stopped hurting almost immediately. At first, people dismissed it as coincidence. Children were resilient. Pain came and went. The mind could play tricks, especially when you wanted relief badly enough. But then it kept happening. Kendra noticed it too, though she never said anything directly. She'd watch sometimes when neighbors would subtly position themselves near Edna at church gatherings or community events, hoping for a casual touch, a brief moment of contact that might ease whatever was bothering them. She saw how people's faces changed after Edna brushed past them. The sudden relaxation of tensed shoulders, the surprised blink when chronic discomfort simply faded away. "You're special, baby," Kendra told Edna one night, braiding her daughter's hair before bed. "God gave you something precious. But you need to be careful with it, you hear? Not everyone understands gifts they can't explain. Some people get scared. Some people get jealous. You keep it quiet, keep it close. Use it when you can help, but don't make a show of it." Edna was only 12 years old then, but she understood. She had already learned that being different in their neighborhood could be dangerous. So she was careful. She helped when she could, but she never talked about it. She let people believe what they wanted to believe. Coincidence, luck, imagination, anything but the truth. The truth was something she barely understood herself. All she knew was that sometimes when she touched someone who was hurting, she could feel their pain like an echo in her own body. And if she focused, if she concentrated on that connection, the pain would drain away from them and disappear into her like water into sand. It left her tired sometimes, but never hurt. It felt right, like this was what her hands were meant to do. Kendra never asked her to stop. She just reminded her to be wise about it. "The world isn't kind to people like us," she'd say. "We have to be twice as careful, twice as smart. You understand." Edna understood. The contrast between Edna's childhood and the world her mother cleaned each night couldn't have been more stark. Every evening, Kendra would put on her uniform, a plain gray shirt and matching pants with her name embroidered on the chest, and take 2 buses across the city to the financial district. She'd arrive at buildings so tall they seemed to touch the sky, structures made of glass and steel that reflected the city lights like beacons of power and wealth. Inside those buildings, the world was different. The lobbies had marble floors so polished you could see your reflection. The elevators had mirrors and soft music. The offices on the upper floors had floor-to-ceiling windows with views that stretched for miles, designer furniture that cost more than Kendra made in a year, and artwork that she didn't understand but knew was expensive because everything in those spaces was expensive. Kendra cleaned all of it. She scrubbed the toilets that executives used. She emptied trash cans filled with discarded documents and half-eaten catered lunches. She vacuumed carpets in conference rooms where people made decisions about millions of dollars. She wiped down desks where contracts were signed and deals were sealed and futures were decided. Sometimes she'd find things left behind. A designer watch forgotten on a bathroom counter, worth more than 3 months of her salary. A cashmere coat draped over a chair, abandoned because its owner had so many coats they didn't bother keeping track. Credit card receipts from restaurants where a single meal cost what Kendra spent on groceries for a month. She never took anything. Not once. Not even when no one would have known. Not even when the temptation whispered that these people wouldn't even notice, that they had so much and she had so little. "We don't steal," she'd remind herself in her mother's voice, in her own voice, in the voice of the values she was building into her daughter brick by brick. Sometimes executives would still be working when Kendra arrived. They'd barely glance at her as she emptied their trash or wiped down their conference table. To them, she was invisible. Just another piece of the building's infrastructure, as unremarkable as the ventilation system or the security cameras. They'd continue their phone calls, their meetings, their important conversations as if she wasn't there at all. Kendra didn't mind the invisibility. It made the work easier in some ways. But she noticed everything. She noticed which executives left messes for her to clean up without a second thought and which ones left thank you notes with holiday bonuses. She noticed which companies treated their janitorial staff with basic respect and which ones acted like they were doing them a favor by employing them. She noticed the way power worked in these buildings, the way money moved, the way people climbed over each other to get closer to the top. And she came home each morning and told Edna about a different world. There's people up in those towers making more money in a day than we see in a year, Kendra would say, peeling off her work boots and massaging her aching feet. And you know what? Most of them aren't smarter than you. They're not better than you. They just got different opportunities, different doors that opened for them. So how do I get those doors to open for me? Young Edna would ask. You work harder than anyone expects. You learn everything you can. You prove you're valuable, and you never give anyone a reason to doubt your character. Kendra would look at her daughter with fierce determination. You're going to college, baby. You're going to wear nice clothes and work in one of those offices. Not cleaning them, working in them. You hear me? I hear you, Mama. And when you get there, when you're sitting at one of those big desks making those big decisions, you remember where you came from. You remember the people who clean those offices and serve those lunches and keep everything running. You remember that they're human beings with families and dreams just like everyone else. You promise me that. I promise. Edna kept that promise. She worked 3 jobs through college, graduated with honors, and clawed her way into the corporate world that her mother had only seen from the outside. She became the secretary who made things happen, who anticipated needs before they were spoken, who handled crises with calm efficiency. And she never forgot the people who cleaned the offices at night. She learned their names. She thanked them for their work. She made sure they received their holiday bonuses and that their complaints were heard. Other executives looked at her strangely for bothering to notice the janitorial staff, but Edna didn't care. She knew what invisibility felt like. She refused to inflict it on anyone else. Kendra had died during Edna's final year of college. The cough that she'd ignored for years had turned out to be something worse. Something that could have been treated if she'd sought help earlier, if she'd had insurance, if she'd felt like she deserved medical care as much as she deserved to pay rent. By the time she finally went to a doctor, it was too late. Edna held her mother's hand in the hospital during those final days. Kendra's skin felt paper thin, her breathing labored, but her eyes were still fierce with pride when she looked at her daughter. You did good, baby, she whispered. You're going to do even better. I learned from the best, Mama. Remember what I taught you. Remember where you came from. Don't let them make you forget. I won't. I promise. Kendra squeezed her hand weakly. And that gift of yours, use it when you can. Help people. That's what it's for. Those were almost her last words. Edna kept both promises. She remembered where she came from. She used her gift quietly, carefully, just as her mother had taught her. A coworker with a migraine who felt mysteriously better after Edna touched their shoulder. An executive with chronic pain who found relief after shaking her hand. She never made a show of it, never took credit, never drew attention. She just helped when she could, the way her mother had taught her to help. And now, sitting in that courtroom with her entire life unraveling, Edna realized how much she'd become like Kendra. She was invisible again. Just another woman the powerful could dispose of when convenient. Her 8 years of loyal service meant nothing in the face of their narrative. Her dignity, her character, her truth. All of it was invisible beneath the weight of their accusations. But Kendra had also taught her something else. She'd taught her that invisible didn't mean powerless. That quiet didn't mean weak. That the people who cleaned the floors and emptied the trash and did the work no one wanted to notice were often the ones who saw everything. They knew where the bodies were buried. They knew which doors led to which secrets. They knew the truth that powerful people tried to hide. And sometimes, just sometimes, that knowledge was enough to bring an entire empire crashing down. Edna sat in that courtroom, looking at Wallace Thompson's cold eyes across the room, and she thought about her mother. About the buildings Kendra had cleaned. About the executives who had never bothered to learn her name. About the world that had worked her to death and then forgotten she'd ever existed. She thought about Kelly Warren, Wallace's ex-wife, walking through those courtroom doors with evidence that would change everything. And she understood. Kelly had been invisible too, once. A trophy wife, dismissed and discarded when she was no longer useful. But invisible people saw things. They noticed things. They remembered things that powerful people assumed would stay buried. Two worlds were about to collide in that courtroom. The world of power and money and polished lies. And the world of people who had been underestimated, overlooked and pushed aside. Edna had lived in both worlds. She knew how this story would end. The powerful always believed they were untouchable. Right up until the moment they realized that the people they'd made invisible had been watching all along. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. Edna sat on the hard wooden bench reserved for the accused, her hands folded in her lap to keep them from shaking. Across the aisle, Wallace Thompson sat flanked by his legal team. 3 attorneys in expensive suits, their briefcases polished, their expressions confident. Karen Blankenship sat closest to Wallace, leaning in occasionally to whisper something in his ear. Each time she did, Wallace would nod, his face unreadable. Edna watched them and felt the weight of memory pressing down on her chest. She hadn't always been afraid of Karen Blankenship. 6 months earlier, Thompson Enterprises had been a different place. Edna remembered the morning Karen first walked through the office doors. It was a Tuesday in March, unseasonably warm, and Wallace had called an impromptu meeting to introduce his new strategic legal counsel. Karen had arrived wearing a slate gray suit that probably cost more than Edna made in a month. Her blonde hair pulled back in a severe bun, her smile sharp and professional. Karen comes highly recommended, Wallace had told the senior staff gathered in the conference room. She's going to help us navigate some complex regulatory issues and position the company for our next phase of growth. Edna had smiled politely from her seat near the back. She'd worked with dozens of lawyers over the years. Corporate attorneys were a constant presence in Wallace's world. Most of them were competent but forgettable, there to review contracts and sit in on negotiations. She'd assumed Karen would be the same. She'd been wrong. Within 2 weeks, Karen had established herself not just as legal counsel but as Wallace's most trusted advisor. She sat in on meetings that had nothing to do with legal matters. She weighed in on hiring decisions, marketing strategies, even personal matters. Wallace, who had always been fiercely independent in his decision-making, suddenly deferred to Karen on almost everything. Edna had noticed the shift but hadn't understood it. Not at first. The first real warning sign came in May. Edna had been reviewing the monthly financial reports, something she'd done for years as part of her responsibilities. She knew Thompson Enterprises accounts better than almost anyone except the CFO. She knew the rhythm of the numbers, the patterns of cash flow, the normal fluctuations of a company their size. But that month something was off. There was a transfer she didn't recognize. $2 million had moved from one of their offshore accounts to another account she'd never seen before. The transaction was coded as a strategic investment reallocation, but there was no corresponding paperwork in the files. No board approval. No investment prospectus. Nothing. Edna had frowned at her computer screen, scrolling through the documentation again. She'd handled hundreds of transactions like this before, and there was always a paper trail. Always authorization forms, always meeting minutes, always something to explain where the money was going and why. This time, there was nothing except her digital signature authorizing the transfer. Except she hadn't authorized anything. Her hands had gone cold as she stared at the screen. Someone had used her credentials to move $2 million without her knowledge. Someone had forged her authorization. She'd printed the reports immediately and gone straight to Wallace's office. "I need to show you something," she'd said, closing the door behind her. "There's a transaction in last month's reports that I didn't authorize. Someone used my access codes." Wallace had been on a phone call. He'd held up one finger, asking her to wait, and finished his conversation. When he finally hung up, he'd looked at her with mild impatience. "What's the problem, Edna?" She'd spread the printouts on his desk, pointing to the highlighted sections. "This transfer. $2 million moved to an account I've never seen before. It shows my authorization, but I never approved this. I never even saw the request." Wallace had glanced at the papers, his expression unchanged. "Let me look into it." "Wallace, this is serious. If someone has access to my credentials, they could." "I said I'll look into it." His tone had been dismissive, almost annoyed. "You've been working long hours, Edna. Maybe you forgot. It happens." "I didn't forget. I would never forget a $2 million transfer." "Then maybe it was an administrative error. I'll have accounting review it." He'd gathered the papers and set them aside. "Don't worry about it. I'm sure it's nothing." But it hadn't been nothing. 2 days later, when Edna tried to access the financial systems to follow up, she found her access had been restricted. Half the accounts she normally monitored were suddenly blocked. When she'd asked the IT department about it, they told her the restrictions had come from the legal department. From Karen Blankenship specifically. "New security protocols," the IT manager had explained apologetically. "Ms. Blankenship says we're tightening access to sensitive financial data. You'll still have access to what you need for your daily responsibilities, but the offshore accounts are now limited to executive level only." Edna had felt the first real flutter of fear in her chest. "I've had access to those accounts for 8 years. I need them to do my job." "I know, and I'm sorry. But the order came from the top. If you want to contest it, you'll have to take it up with Mr. Thompson or Ms. Blankenship." She'd tried. She'd gone to Wallace's office 3 times that week, but each time his assistant told her he was in meetings with Karen. She'd sent emails that went unanswered. She'd left voicemails that were never returned. And then the emails started disappearing. Messages she'd sent to the CFO about the suspicious transaction vanished from her sent folder. Copies she'd forwarded to her personal email never arrived. Documents she'd saved to the company server were suddenly nowhere to be found. Someone was erasing her digital footprints. Someone was systematically removing any evidence that she'd questioned the transfer or raised concerns about security. By June, Edna knew something was very wrong. But she didn't know what to do about it. Wallace wouldn't listen to her. Karen had consolidated power so quickly that challenging her felt dangerous. The other executives either hadn't noticed the changes or didn't care enough to speak up. Edna had started keeping her own records. She printed emails before they could disappear. She photographed financial reports on her phone. She created a hidden folder on her personal laptop where she documented every irregularity, every suspicious transaction, every access denial. She didn't know what she was preparing for. She just knew she needed insurance. Then, in July, Karen had called her into her office. "Edna, we need to discuss your performance," Karen had said, her voice coolly professional. "Mr. Thompson has expressed some concerns about your attention to detail lately." Edna had felt her stomach drop. Concerns? What concerns? Missing files. Delayed responses to requests. A general sense that you're not as focused as you once were. Karen had smiled, but it hadn't reached her eyes. "We understand you've been here a long time. Sometimes people get complacent. We're not firing you, of course. We're just keeping an eye on things." It had been a warning shot. A subtle threat wrapped in corporate language. Edna had left that meeting understanding that she was being set up. She just hadn't realized how thorough the setup would be until the day security escorted her out of the building with TV cameras waiting outside. Now, sitting in the courtroom, those memories played in Edna's mind like a horror film she couldn't stop watching. She understood now what she hadn't understood then. The suspicious transfer had been a test, a way to see if she'd notice, if she'd speak up, if she'd become a problem. When she'd gone to Wallace with questions, Karen had known she needed to be silenced. The access restrictions, the disappearing emails, the manufactured performance concerns, all of it had been building toward this moment. Karen hadn't just framed her. She'd isolated her first. Made sure no one would believe her when the accusation finally came. Made sure all the evidence pointed in one direction. The judge's voice pulled Edna back to the present. We'll take a 30-minute recess before we hear opening statements. Court will resume at 2 o'clock. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that made Edna flinch. People began filing out of the courtroom. Wallace and his legal team stood and moved toward the private conference room reserved for them. Karen touched Wallace's elbow, guiding him like he was a child who needed direction. He didn't seem to notice. Edna stayed in her seat. She had nowhere to go, no one to confer with. The young legal aid intern who was supposed to represent her had sent an apologetic email that morning saying he'd been reassigned to another case. Something about a conflict of interest that made no sense but left her completely alone. She watched the courtroom empty until only a handful of people remained. A few reporters still typing on their laptops, a court officer organizing paperwork, an older woman in the back row who'd been knitting throughout the morning session. Edna closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. Ms. Hyde. She looked up to find a woman standing at the end of her bench. She was in her mid-30s, black, wearing a press badge and carrying a worn leather notebook. "I'm Monica Dean," the woman said. "I'm a reporter with the Metro Chronicle. Do you have a moment?" Edna's first instinct was to refuse. The media had been crucifying her for weeks. Every article painted her as a thief, a manipulator, a woman who'd betrayed the trust of a generous employer. Why would this reporter be any different? But something in Monica's expression made her pause. There was no judgment there. No predatory eagerness. Just a quiet intelligence and what looked like genuine curiosity. "I don't think I should talk to the press," Edna said carefully. "I understand." Monica glanced around the nearly empty courtroom. "Can I sit for just a moment? Off the record. No recording, no quotes. Just a conversation." Edna hesitated, then nodded. Monica slid onto the bench, maintaining a respectful distance. She set her notebook down closed, a gesture that felt significant. "I've been covering this case since the beginning," Monica said quietly. "And I've also been covering Wallace Thompson for 3 years. Do you know what I've learned about him in that time?" Edna shook her head. "He's a genius at controlling narratives. Whenever there's a problem, a lawsuit, a scandal, a business deal gone wrong, he doesn't just fix the problem. He rewrites the story. He makes sure the public sees what he wants them to see, believes what he wants them to believe." Monica paused. "And he's very good at making people disappear from the story when they become inconvenient." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I think you've been disappeared." Monica met her eyes directly. "I think you've been written out of your own story, and I think the real story is something completely different from what we've been told." Edna felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. It was the first time since this nightmare began that anyone had suggested she might be telling the truth. "I can't prove anything," Edna whispered. "They took everything. My access, my emails, my records. Everything I saved disappeared. Did you keep anything? Anything at all outside of the company systems?" Edna thought about the hidden folder on her personal laptop, the printed emails, the photographs on her phone. She'd been so careful, so paranoid. But she'd also been terrified to show any of it to anyone, afraid it would somehow make things worse. "Maybe," she said slowly, "I might have some things." Monica leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Hyde, I can't promise I can fix this. But I can promise that if you let me look at whatever you have, I'll tell the truth about what I find. No matter what Wallace Thompson wants people to believe." "You'd risk your career for that?" "I became a reporter to tell the truth. What's the point if I only tell the convenient parts?" Monica pulled out a business card and set it on the bench between them. "Think about it. If you decide you want to talk, call me. Anytime, day or night." She stood and walked away, leaving the card behind. Edna picked it up with trembling fingers. Monica Dean, investigative reporter. A phone number and an email address. The courtroom was almost empty now. In a few minutes, the recess would end and they'd come back for opening statements. Karen would stand up and tell a carefully constructed story about a trusted secretary who got greedy, who abused her position, who stole from the man who'd given her everything. And Edna would sit here, alone and voiceless, while the lie was told. Unless. She looked down at the business card in her hand. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Don't let them make you forget who you are. Don't let them make you small. Edna had spent the past 2 months feeling small. Feeling powerless. Feeling like the world had decided her fate before she even had a chance to defend herself. But she wasn't powerless. She had evidence. She had the truth. And now, maybe, she had someone who would actually listen. The court officer called out, "Court will resume in 5 minutes. Please take your seats." People began filing back in. The reporters returned to their section. The court stenographer settled at her machine. Wallace and his legal team emerged from their conference room, Karen leading the way with her briefcase and her confident stride. Edna stood slowly. Her legs felt shaky, but she forced them to hold her weight. She looked across the courtroom at Wallace. He was looking at his phone, scrolling through messages, completely unconcerned. Why would he be concerned? He had the best lawyers money could buy. He had a narrative the public had already accepted. He had power and resources and every advantage. But he didn't have the truth. Edna sat back down as the judge entered. Everyone rose, then settled again as the hearing prepared to continue. Karen stood to deliver her opening statement, but Edna barely heard the words. She was thinking about her mother, about the buildings Kendra had cleaned, the secret she'd witnessed, the power she'd seen up close from the invisible position of someone nobody bothered to notice. She was thinking about the documents hidden on her laptop, the emails she'd printed, the photographs of financial records, the timeline she'd constructed of Karen's systematic takeover of Wallace's company. She was thinking about Monica Dean's card in her pocket. The hearing droned on around her, Karen's voice smooth and persuasive, painting a picture of betrayal and greed. The reporters scribbled notes. Wallace watched with that same cold, distant expression. But Edna wasn't listening anymore. She was making a decision. When the judge finally dismissed them for the day, Edna walked out of the courthouse into the harsh afternoon sunlight. Reporters shouted questions at her, but she kept walking, her head down, until she reached the bus stop a block away. She sat on the bench and pulled out her phone. Found Monica Dean's number. Stared at it for a long moment. Then she pressed call. It rang twice before Monica answered. "This is Monica." "Ms. Dean, this is Edna Hyde." Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "I have something to show you. Can we meet?" There was a brief pause, then. "Yes. Absolutely. Where and when?" "Tonight. 7 o'clock. There's a coffee shop on Elm Street called Brewer's Cup. Do you know it?" "I'll find it. I'll be there." "Bring your notebook," Edna said. "This is going to be a long conversation." She ended the call and sat there for a moment, watching the traffic pass, feeling the weight of what she'd just set in motion. The bus arrived. Edna climbed aboard and found a seat near the back. As the city rolled past outside the window, she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer her mother had taught her years ago. "Give me strength to speak truth to power. Give me courage to stand when I want to fall. Let justice find a way, even when the path seems impossible." She opened her eyes and looked at her reflection in the bus window. She looked tired, scared, beaten down. But she was still standing. Tomorrow she'd go back to that courtroom. She'd face Karen's lies and Wallace's betrayal and the weight of a system designed to protect people like them. But tonight, she was going to tell someone the truth. All of it. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to change everything. The bus carried her home through the golden afternoon light, toward an evening that would reshape the battle ahead. Edna didn't know if the truth would be enough to save her. But she knew her mother hadn't raised her to go down without a fight. And this fight was just beginning. Wallace Thompson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, 43 stories above the city, and told himself he'd made the right decision. The skyline stretched before him like a kingdom he'd built with his own hands. Thompson Enterprises occupied 3 buildings in the financial district, their logos glowing against the twilight sky. Billboards carried his company's name. Politicians returned his calls. Magazines put his face on their covers with headlines like, "The Man Who Built an Empire." He'd worked 30 years to create this. 30 years of 18-hour days, strategic risks, and careful reputation management. He'd survived 2 recessions, countless competitors, and more than a few scandals. He knew how to protect what was his. And right now, what was his needed protecting. "You did the right thing," Karen had told him when they'd first discussed the Edna situation. They'd been in his office late at night, going over the financial irregularities she'd discovered. "I know she's been with you a long time, but loyalty doesn't excuse theft." Wallace had nodded, though something in his chest had tightened. "I just never thought. Edna, of all people. That's what makes her dangerous. You trusted her completely. She had access to everything." Karen had leaned forward, her expression sympathetic but firm. "Wallace, if this gets out without you taking swift action, the board will question your judgment. Investors will wonder what else you've missed. Your competitors will smell blood in the water. So we go public. We control the narrative before it controls us. We frame this as you being vigilant, catching the problem, taking decisive action. You're the victim here, but you're also the hero who stopped it." Karen had touched his hand briefly, a gesture that seemed both professional and intimate. "Let me handle the details. You focus on running the company. That's what you do best." He'd let her handle it. And she'd been right. The public response had been exactly what she'd predicted. Sympathy for him. Outrage at Edna. His company's stock had barely flickered because he'd been seen as decisive and strong. So why did he still feel uneasy? Wallace turned away from the window and walked to his bar, pouring 2 fingers of scotch he didn't really want. The penthouse was silent except for the ambient hum of the city below. His housekeeper had left hours ago. He was alone with his thoughts, and his thoughts kept circling back to the same uncomfortable questions. Had Edna really stolen from him? Or had he simply needed someone to blame when the accounts didn't add up? He pushed the thought away and took a drink, letting the burn distract him. His phone buzzed with a text from Karen. "How are you holding up?" Wallace typed back, "Fine. Just going over tomorrow's testimony in my head. Don't overthink it. Just tell the truth. She betrayed your trust. The jury will see that." "Right." He set the phone down and returned to the window. Somewhere out there, Edna was probably in her small apartment, alone and frightened, preparing for a trial she couldn't possibly win. He tried to imagine her face, the woman who'd brought him coffee exactly how he liked it for 8 years, who'd remembered his mother's birthday when he'd forgotten, who'd stayed late on countless nights to help him prepare for board meetings. She'd called him family once. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and uncomfortable. It had been 3 weeks before the accusation. Wallace had been in his office late, stressed about a deal that was falling apart. Edna had knocked softly and entered with a folder. "The revised contracts from Singapore," she'd said, setting them on his desk. "I flagged the sections that changed from the last version." "Thank you, Edna." He'd barely looked up. She'd hesitated at the door. "Mr. Thompson, Wallace, can I ask you something?" He'd glanced up then, surprised by her tone. She'd never been uncertain with him before. "Of course. Is everything all right? You seem different lately." Distant. Wallace had frowned. "I'm fine. Just busy. You know how it is." "It's not just that." She'd taken a step closer, her voice gentle. "Ever since Ms. Blankenship joined the team, you've been, I don't know, harder to reach. And I've noticed some things in the accounts that don't." "Edna, I appreciate your concern, but I have it under control." His tone had been sharper than he'd intended. "Karen is helping me restructure some things. It's complicated, but it's all above board. I'm sure it is. I just wanted to make sure you knew that if you needed anything, if there was something wrong, you could tell me. You know that, right?" Her eyes had been earnest, almost pleading. "You're the only family I've really known since my mother passed. I'd do anything to help you." The words had struck him like a physical blow. "You're the only family I've really known." He'd looked at her then, really looked at her, and seen the genuine care in her expression. Edna had never asked him for anything in 8 years. Never complained. Never overstepped. She'd been the one constant in a world of shifting alliances and temporary loyalties. And she'd just told him he was family. "I know, Edna," he'd said softly. "And I appreciate that more than you know." She'd smiled, relieved. "Okay. Good. I wanted you to know." She'd left, and Wallace had sat there feeling something uncomfortably close to guilt. Because even then, Karen had already been planting seeds of doubt about Edna's loyalty. Even then, he'd been starting to pull away from her, to question her, to see her as a potential liability rather than a trusted partner. 3 weeks later, he'd let Karen make the accusation public. He'd let security escort Edna out. He'd let the media destroy her reputation. He'd told himself it was necessary. That the evidence was clear. That he was protecting his company. But he'd never forgotten the look on Edna's face when security had taken her ID badge. The confusion. The hurt. The betrayal. "You're the only family I've really known." Wallace drained his scotch and poured another. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Karen. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we seal this case shut. Edna will be convicted, and we can all move on." Wallace stared at the message for a long moment. Then he typed, "Did she really do it, Karen? Are we absolutely certain?" The response came quickly. "Wallace, we've been over this. The evidence is overwhelming. Her digital signature, her access codes, her authorization. Who else could it have been? I just keep thinking about how shocked she looked. How she tried to tell me something was wrong. Of course she did. That's what guilty people do. They try to create doubt before they're caught. Don't let her manipulate you now. Stay focused on protecting what you've built." Wallace read the message twice, then set his phone face down on the bar. Karen was right. She had to be right. Because if she wasn't, if Edna really was innocent, then he'd destroyed an innocent woman's life to save his own reputation. And Wallace Thompson couldn't live with that. So he told himself again that he'd made the right decision. That the evidence was clear. That sometimes loyalty had to be sacrificed for the greater good. He returned to the window and stared out at his empire, trying to convince himself that the view was worth the cost. 15 blocks away, in a modest high-rise office building, Karen Blankenship sat at her desk and smiled at her computer screen. The office was dark except for the glow of her monitors. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. Karen preferred working late. There were fewer eyes, fewer questions, fewer interruptions. She pulled up Thomson Enterprises' offshore account system, entering her access codes with practiced efficiency. The accounts appeared on her screen, columns of numbers representing millions of dollars flowing through carefully constructed channels. Karen had been moving money for months now, small amounts at first, then increasingly larger transfers as she'd grown confident that no one was watching closely enough to notice. She'd set up shell companies, offshore holdings, investment vehicles that existed only on paper. Wallace had signed off on most of it without really understanding what he was approving. He trusted her judgment completely. That was the thing about men like Wallace Thompson. They were so used to being the smartest person in the room that they never expected someone to be smarter. So used to controlling the narrative that they never realized when they'd become characters in someone else's story. Karen had studied Wallace for months before accepting the position at Thomson Enterprises. She'd learned his patterns, his blind spots, his weaknesses. She'd known that he valued loyalty above almost everything else, which meant he could be manipulated through that loyalty. She'd known that he feared public scandal more than private failure, which meant he'd sacrifice anyone to protect his image. And she'd known that he had a secretary who knew too much and could be framed perfectly when the time came. Edna had been an obstacle from the beginning. She was too observant, too conscientious, too close to Wallace. She'd noticed the irregular transfers within weeks. Karen had seen it in her questions, her subtle probing, her attempts to discuss accounting inconsistencies with Wallace. So Karen had done what she always did with obstacles. She'd removed them. It had been almost too easy. Forge a few documents. Plant some digital evidence. Restrict Edna's access while claiming it was for security. Delete the emails where Edna had tried to raise concerns. And then, when everything was in place, make the accusation publicly and dramatically, giving Wallace no choice but to support her or look weak. Wallace had supported her. Of course he had. Men like him always chose themselves in the end, no matter how much they claimed to value loyalty and integrity. Karen initiated another transfer. $500,000 this time, routed through 3 shell companies before landing in an account in the Cayman Islands that existed under a name that would never be traced back to her. She'd been careful, methodical, patient. In another month, maybe 2, she'd have enough money moved to disappear completely. She'd resign from Thompson Enterprises, citing personal reasons or a better opportunity. Wallace would give her a generous severance package because that's what men like him did to maintain good relationships. And she'd vanish into a comfortable retirement in a country with no extradition treaty and no questions about where money came from. But first, she had to finish destroying Edna Hyde. Karen pulled up the testimony she'd been preparing. She'd spent weeks crafting it, every word chosen for maximum impact, every detail designed to make Edna look calculating and cold. She'd practiced her delivery in the mirror until it was perfect. Sympathetic but firm, reluctant but certain. She was good at this. She'd done it before, in other companies, to other people who'd gotten too close to discovering her methods. She knew how to manipulate systems, how to exploit trust, how to turn people against each other. And she knew how to win. Her computer chimed with an incoming email. Karen glanced at it absently, expecting spam or an automated system notification. But the sender's name made her freeze. KW. Karen's hand hovered over the mouse. She didn't know anyone with those initials. Hadn't given her work email to anyone who would use those initials. She clicked the email open. The message was brief. Ms. Blankenship, I know what you're doing. I know about the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the evidence you manufactured against Edna Hyde. We need to talk. Soon. KW. Karen's smile disappeared. Her mind raced through possibilities. Who could have sent this? Someone at Thompson Enterprises? A federal investigator? A rival trying to blackmail her? She checked the email headers, trying to trace the origin, but it had been routed through multiple anonymous servers. Professional-grade security. Whoever sent this knew what they were doing. Karen sat back in her chair, her jaw tight. This was a problem. Potentially a serious problem. But she'd dealt with problems before. She'd dealt with obstacles and threats and people who thought they were clever enough to stop her. She'd always won. Karen closed the email and returned to her testimony preparation. Whoever KW was, they'd have to wait. Right now, she had a trial to win and a secretary to bury. She'd deal with this new complication after Edna Hyde was convicted. Karen worked for another hour, perfecting her testimony, ensuring every detail was airtight. When she finally shut down her computer and gathered her things, it was nearly midnight. The office building was silent as she walked to the elevator. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, the only sound in the vast emptiness. As the elevator descended, Karen thought about tomorrow, about the courtroom, about Wallace sitting beside her, trusting her completely, about Edna sitting alone across the aisle, desperate and powerless, about the verdict that was already decided. She smiled again. The elevator doors opened to the parking garage. Karen stepped out, her briefcase in hand, already planning her next move. Behind her, security cameras captured her departure. The footage would be stored on servers, backed up automatically, preserved in digital amber. Karen didn't notice the cameras. She never did. She walked to her car, confident and controlled, believing she'd thought of everything. She was wrong. In a quiet house in the suburbs, Kelly Warren sat at her dining room table, staring at her laptop screen. The email to Karen Blankenship had been sent 3 hours ago. Kelly had been watching for a response, but none had come. That was fine. The email wasn't really a request for conversation. It was a warning shot. A way of letting Karen know that someone was watching, someone knew, someone was coming. Kelly looked at the documents spread across her table. Financial records. Email printouts. Audio files. Everything she'd been gathering for the past 6 weeks. Ever since she'd read about Edna Hyde's arrest and recognized the pattern. She'd seen this before. When she'd been married to Wallace, she'd noticed irregularities in their accounts. Money moving in ways that didn't make sense. Offshore holdings that Wallace seemed vague about when she'd asked. She'd suspected someone was embezzling from Thompson Enterprises, but she'd never been able to prove it. Then she'd seen Karen Blankenship's name in the news, and everything had clicked into place. Kelly had met Karen once, years ago, at a corporate function. She'd worked for one of Wallace's competitors under a different name. Kelly had remembered her because she'd been so charming, so effortlessly persuasive, and because 2 months after that function, the company she'd worked for had experienced a massive financial scandal that destroyed its CEO and half its board. Karen had disappeared before anyone could investigate her involvement. And now she was doing it again, this time using Edna Hyde as her scapegoat. Kelly closed her laptop and looked at the stack of files beside her. She had enough evidence to destroy Karen and expose everything she'd done. She had emails proving Karen had forged documents. She had financial records showing the real destination of the stolen money. She even had an audio recording from her divorce proceedings where Wallace had admitted, on the record, that he sometimes authorized transfers using other employees' credentials without their knowledge. That recording alone would prove Edna's innocence. Kelly had wanted to stay away from Wallace's world. The divorce had been brutal, and she'd sworn she'd never look back. But then she'd seen Edna's face on the news, a black woman being destroyed by the same system that had protected her ex-husband, and Kelly had realized she couldn't stay silent. Not this time. She picked up her phone and dialed a number she'd found through some creative research. It rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "This is Monica Dean." "Ms. Dean, my name is Kelly Warren. I believe we need to talk about the Edna Hyde case." There was a pause. Kelly Warren? As in Wallace Thompson's ex-wife? "Yes. I'm listening. I have evidence that will prove Edna Hyde is innocent. Evidence that will expose who really stole from Thompson Enterprises." Kelly took a breath. "And I'd like to present it in court. Publicly. Where it can't be buried or ignored." Another pause, longer this time. Then, "Ms. Warren, when can we meet?" "Tomorrow morning. Before the trial resumes." "I'll be there." Kelly ended the call and sat in the quiet of her dining room, feeling the weight of what she was about to do. This would hurt Wallace. It would destroy Karen. It would make Kelly a target of the same powerful people who tried to erase Edna. But Kelly had been married to a man who valued power over truth. She'd watched him sacrifice people to protect his image. She'd been complicit in that system once, staying silent to preserve her comfortable life. She wouldn't be complicit anymore. Kelly gathered her documents and placed them carefully in a leather portfolio. Tomorrow she'd walk into that courtroom and tell the truth, whatever the cost. Kelly Warren had been trying to forget Wallace Thompson for 3 years. She'd moved to a villa 40 minutes outside the city, a place where the air was cleaner and the neighbors were sparse enough that no one recognized her name or cared about her past. She'd rebuilt her life piece by piece. New routines, new friends, a small consulting business that kept her busy without consuming her. She'd learned to garden, taken up painting, adopted a rescue dog named Miles who slept at the foot of her bed and asked nothing of her except food and affection. She'd been healing. Moving forward. Learning to be Kelly Warren again instead of Wallace Thompson's ex-wife. Then she'd seen Edna Hyde's face on the news, and the past had come rushing back like a flood. Kelly had been making breakfast when the story appeared on the morning news program she played in the background. She'd glanced at the television absently, expecting the usual rotation of weather and traffic and political scandals. Instead, she'd seen footage of a black woman being escorted from an office building by security, her face stricken, cameras flashing around her. The headline beneath read, "Thompson Enterprises secretary accused of $2 million embezzlement." Kelly had frozen, spatula in hand, as the reporter's voice explained the situation. Edna Hyde, longtime secretary to billionaire Wallace Thompson, stands accused of diverting $2 million from company accounts. Thompson's legal counsel, Karen Blankenship, announced the charges yesterday in a press conference, stating that the evidence is overwhelming. The camera had cut to Karen Blankenship standing at a podium, blonde hair perfect, expression appropriately grave as she described Edna's betrayal of trust and Wallace's devastating disappointment. Kelly had set down the spatula carefully, her hands beginning to shake. She knew that face. She knew that voice. She knew those tactics. Karen Blankenship had been called something else when Kelly first encountered her. Rebecca Winters, or maybe Rachel Blackwood. The name had changed, but the face was unmistakable. Kelly had seen her once at a corporate gala 6 years ago, when Karen had been working for one of Wallace's competitors. They'd spoken briefly, a forgettable conversation about nothing important. 3 months after that gala, the competitor's company had imploded in a financial scandal. The CEO had been accused of fraud. A loyal employee had taken the fall. And Karen, or whatever she'd been calling herself then, had vanished before anyone could investigate her involvement. Kelly had remembered thinking at the time that something about the scandal felt orchestrated. Too neat. Too convenient. But she'd been dealing with her own problems then, her marriage to Wallace already fracturing, and she hadn't pursued the thought. Now, watching Karen destroy another woman with the same playbook, Kelly felt something cold settle in her chest. She'd turned off the stove and spent the rest of that morning searching the internet for everything she could find about Edna Hyde. The more she read, the more familiar it all felt. The sudden accusation. The public humiliation. The manufactured evidence. The complete destruction of reputation before the trial even began. Kelly had lived through a version of this herself. The memories came back sharp and unwelcome. 4 years ago, when Kelly had finally decided to divorce Wallace, she'd gone into the process believing it would be straightforward. They had a prenuptial agreement. Their assets were clearly defined. She didn't want his money or his properties. She just wanted out of a marriage that had slowly suffocated her. But Wallace didn't do anything straightforward. He'd fought the divorce with every resource at his disposal, not because he loved her or wanted to save the marriage, but because he saw it as a loss of control. Kelly leaving him was a narrative he couldn't accept. It made him look weak. It raised questions about what kind of man couldn't keep his wife happy despite unlimited wealth. So he'd tried to rewrite the story. His lawyers had painted Kelly as unstable, greedy, manipulative. They'd claimed she was having an affair, a complete fabrication, but it didn't matter because once it was in court documents, the media ran with it. They'd suggested she had substance abuse problems, based on nothing except a prescription for anxiety medication her doctor had given her during the divorce proceedings. They'd made her out to be the villain in a story where she'd simply wanted to escape. Kelly had fought back, but it had been exhausting. Every aspect of her life had been scrutinized. Every friendship questioned. Every decision reframed as evidence of her supposed instability. And through it all, she'd noticed something strange in their financial records. Wallace had been required to disclose his assets as part of the divorce. His lawyers had provided documents showing his holdings, his accounts, his investments. Everything appeared legitimate on the surface. Wallace had built his fortune through smart business decisions and careful management. But Kelly had always been good with numbers. She'd majored in economics before meeting Wallace, before she'd gradually been pushed into the role of trophy wife, who attended galas and looked beautiful and didn't ask too many questions about the business. During the divorce, she'd started asking questions again. She'd noticed offshore accounts that didn't quite make sense. Money flowing through shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. Investment vehicles that seemed designed more for opacity than profit. When she'd asked Wallace's lawyers about them, she'd been told they were standard tax optimization strategies, nothing unusual. But Kelly had done her own research. She'd traced the shell companies and found they were newer than the lawyers claimed. Most had been established in the past 3 years. She'd looked at the transaction patterns and seen irregularities that suggested someone was moving money in ways that had nothing to do with legitimate business. She'd suspected embezzlement. Someone stealing from Wallace, using his accounts as a conduit. She'd even tried to warn him, in one of their final face-to-face meetings before the divorce was finalized. "Wallace, I think someone in your company is stealing from you," she'd said. They'd been in his lawyer's conference room, supposed to be negotiating final terms. "These offshore accounts, something isn't right. You should have someone investigate." Wallace had looked at her with cold eyes. Is this another attempt to delay the proceedings, Kelly? Because it's not going to work. I'm serious. Look at these transactions. She'd tried to show him the documents she'd printed, but he'd waved them away. My financial team has reviewed everything thoroughly. If there were any problems, they'd have found them. His tone had been dismissive, almost mocking. Maybe you should worry less about my business and more about moving on with your life. Kelly had left that meeting feeling both frustrated and relieved. Frustrated that he wouldn't listen, relieved that she'd at least tried. Whatever was happening with his company wasn't her problem anymore. She'd done her part by warning him. What he did with that warning was his choice. She'd walked away from the marriage with her settlement. Far less than she could have fought for, but enough to start over, and she'd tried to forget everything about Wallace Thompson and his empire. Until now. Kelly spent 3 days watching news coverage of Edna Hyde's case. The more she watched, the angrier she became. She saw Edna's face in interview footage, the woman clearly traumatized, struggling to explain that she hadn't done anything wrong. She saw Karen Blankenship giving statements with practiced sympathy, painting Edna as a manipulator who'd abused Wallace's trust. She saw Wallace himself in a brief appearance, looking appropriately betrayed, telling reporters he'd trusted Edna like family, and felt deeply disappointed. That phrase, trusted like family, made Kelly's jaw clench. Wallace had used those exact words about her once, back when they'd first started dating. He collected people who would be family, loyal servants to his empire. And then he discarded them the moment they became inconvenient. Kelly watched, and she remembered how it felt to be destroyed by the Thompson legal machine. How it felt to have your truth twisted into lies. How it felt to watch the world believe a carefully crafted narrative while your actual voice was drowned out. She remembered, and she made a decision. On the 4th day, Kelly drove to the storage unit on the outskirts of the city where she'd put everything from her old life. She hadn't been here since the divorce was finalized. She'd told herself she was keeping the boxes in case she ever needed them. But really she'd just been unable to throw away that part of her history, no matter how much she wanted to forget it. The storage unit was small and dusty, filled with boxes labeled in her own handwriting from 3 years ago. Tax records 2019 to 2021, legal documents, personal files. Kelly found the box she needed, divorce discovery, financial, and pulled it down from the stack. Inside were all the documents she'd collected during the divorce proceedings. Bank statements, account summaries, transaction records. And there, in a folder she'd labeled irregularities, were the printouts that had made her suspicious. Offshore account statements showing unusual transfers. Shell company filings that didn't match Wallace's timeline. Transaction patterns that suggested systematic theft rather than legitimate business operations. Kelly spread the documents across the concrete floor of the storage unit, cross-referencing dates and amounts. She'd been right. Someone had been stealing from Wallace for years. The transfers had started small, just a few thousand here and there, but had gradually increased. By the time she'd noticed them during the divorce, whoever was doing this had been moving hundreds of thousands at a time. And now, according to the news, 2 million had gone missing, with Edna Hyde taking the blame. Kelly pulled out her phone and searched for Karen Blankenship's employment history. According to her professional profile, she joined Thompson Enterprises 3 years ago, right around the time Kelly's divorce had been finalized. Right around the time someone would have needed to find a new scapegoat, now that Kelly was no longer around to blame. Kelly sat back on her heels, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Karen had been stealing from Wallace for years, probably from multiple companies before Thompson Enterprises. She'd set up the offshore accounts, moved the money gradually, covered her tracks carefully. And when someone got too close to discovering her, like Kelly had during the divorce, like Edna apparently had more recently, Karen simply framed them and moved on. It was elegant, in a sociopathic way. Use the boss's own paranoia about loyalty and betrayal. Plant evidence that pointed to someone close to him, someone he'd trusted. Make the accusation public so the boss had no choice but to support you or look weak. Then watch as the system destroyed your target while you continued stealing. Kelly gathered the documents and put them back in their folder. She was about to close the box when she noticed something else, a small flash drive taped to the inside lid, labeled divorce audio. She'd forgotten about this. During the divorce proceedings, there had been a private meeting between Kelly, Wallace, and their lawyers. Kelly's attorney had recorded it with everyone's knowledge. It was standard practice for documenting settlement discussions. Most of it had been boring legal negotiation. But Kelly remembered one exchange that had seemed insignificant at the time but now might be crucial. She pulled the flash drive free and headed back to her car. At home, Kelly plugged the flash drive into her laptop and found the audio file. She skipped through the recording until she found the section she remembered. Kelly's attorney: Mr. Thompson, can you explain these transfers to offshore accounts? Ms. Warren has raised concerns about their legitimacy. Wallace: those are standard business operations. Sometimes I authorize transfers using different credentials for security purposes. It's not unusual. Kelly's attorney: but these specific transactions show your secretary's authorization codes. Wallace: I use my secretary's code sometimes. She has my permission to act on my behalf, and sometimes I'll use hers when I need additional authorization layers. It's perfectly legal. Kelly's attorney: so to be clear, you've authorized transactions using your secretary's credentials without her direct involvement? Wallace: yes. When necessary. It's efficient. Kelly paused the recording, her heart pounding. There it was. Wallace admitting on the record that he sometimes authorized transfers using his secretary's credentials without their knowledge. It was buried in a 3-hour recording about property division and asset allocation. Easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But it was proof that Edna Hyde could have been set up. Proof that transactions bearing her authorization didn't necessarily mean she'd made them. Proof that Wallace himself had established a pattern of using his secretary's credentials. Combined with the financial documents showing the pattern of theft stretching back years before Edna was even accused, this could destroy the prosecution's case. Kelly sat at her dining room table for a long time, staring at the documents and the flash drive, thinking about what it would mean to come forward. She'd rebuilt her life specifically to get away from Wallace and his world. Coming forward would drag her back into the spotlight. It would mean facing him again, facing his lawyers, probably facing his anger. The media would have a field day, ex-wife defends accused secretary, and people would question her motives. They'd say she was bitter, vengeful, trying to hurt Wallace because he'd divorced her. Never mind that she'd divorced him. Never mind that she had nothing to gain from this except trouble. But Kelly kept thinking about Edna's face on the news. About the way her hands had shaken when she tried to answer reporters' questions. About the look of someone who'd been betrayed by everything she'd believed in. Kelly had been that woman once. And when she'd been that woman, no one had come to her defense. No one had cared about the truth because the lie was more interesting, more profitable, more convenient. She'd survived anyway, but barely. And she'd done it alone. Edna Hyde didn't have to be alone. Kelly picked up her phone and searched for contact information for the prosecutor's office. Then she hesitated. Going to the prosecutor might not work. They were already convinced of Edna's guilt, and a defensive ex-wife showing up with old documents might be dismissed as exactly what it looked like, a bitter woman trying to cause problems. Kelly needed someone who would actually listen. Someone who was already asking questions. She searched for news coverage of the trial and found several articles by the same reporter, Monica Dean from the Metro Chronicle. She read through Dean's pieces and noticed something. They were more balanced than other coverage, more willing to ask difficult questions about the prosecution's timeline and evidence. Kelly found Dean's email on the Chronicle website and began typing. Ms. Dean, my name is Kelly Warren. I was married to Wallace Thompson from 2017 to 2021. I have evidence that I believe will prove Edna Hyde's innocence and expose who actually stole from Thompson Enterprises. I'd like to present this evidence in court, publicly, where it cannot be buried or ignored. But I need your help to make sure it's heard. Can we meet? Kelly Warren. She sent the email before she could talk herself out of it. Then she opened a new email and typed a shorter message to Karen Blankenship's work address. Ms. Blankenship, I know what you're doing. I know about the offshore accounts, the shell companies, and the evidence you manufactured against Edna Hyde. We need to talk. Soon. KW. Kelly sent that one too. Not because she actually wanted to talk to Karen, but because she wanted Karen to know someone was watching. Someone knew. Someone was coming. Let her worry. Let her wonder. Let her feel the same fear she'd inflicted on others. Kelly closed her laptop and looked out the window of her villa. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Miles padded over and rested his head on her knee, sensing her agitation. "We're going back to the city, buddy," Kelly told the dog softly. "Just for a little while. There's something I have to do." Miles wagged his tail unconcerned. As long as he was with Kelly, he was happy. Kelly wished she could be that simple, that trusting. But she'd learned the hard way that the world wasn't kind to women who expected fairness or loyalty. The world was built for people like Wallace and Karen. People who used power without conscience, who sacrificed others to protect themselves. But sometimes, if you were lucky, you got a chance to push back. Kelly gathered her documents, her flash drive, her courage. Tomorrow she'd go to the courthouse. Tomorrow she'd face Wallace again. Tomorrow she'd tell the truth that might destroy her ex-husband's reputation and her own peace. But tonight she sat in her quiet villa with her dog, feeling her mother's old words echo in her memory. When you see injustice and do nothing, you become part of it. Kelly had been part of it once, staying silent to protect herself. She wouldn't be part of it again. She made herself dinner, fed Miles, and packed an overnight bag. In the morning, she'd drive to the city and meet with Monica Dean. She'd prepare to walk into that courtroom. She'd prepare to become the ghost that Wallace Thompson had tried to forget, the ex-wife who knew too much, who'd seen too much, who was done staying silent. Kelly Warren had spent 3 years trying to forget Wallace Thompson. Now she was going to make sure he never forgot her. The courtroom felt like a tomb. Edna sat perfectly still on the hard wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a spot on the wall behind the judge's head. She'd learned over the past 3 days of trial that if she looked at the faces in the gallery, the reporters with their hungry expressions, the spectators who'd come for entertainment, the Thompson Enterprises employees who'd once been her colleagues, she would break down completely. So she looked at the wall, at the seal of the state court system, at anything that wasn't human. Karen Blankenship stood at the prosecutor's table, arranging her notes with the precise movements of someone who'd already won. She wore a navy suit today, expensive but not ostentatious, projecting an image of sober professionalism. Her blonde hair was pulled back in her signature severe bun. A simple gold watch caught the light as she straightened her papers. She looked like justice personified. Edna knew better. "Your Honor," Karen began, her voice carrying the perfect mixture of regret and resolve. "Over the past 3 days, this court has heard overwhelming evidence of a betrayal that cuts to the very heart of what we value in our society: trust." Edna's hands tightened in her lap. "Wallace Thompson is a man who built an empire through hard work, vision, and careful stewardship of resources," Karen continued, pacing slowly before the judge's bench. "He employed hundreds of people. He contributed millions to this city's economy. And like many successful men, he relied on people close to him, people he trusted implicitly, to help manage the details of his complex business operations." Karen turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom. She didn't look at Edna directly, but the implication was clear. Edna Hyde was one of those people. For 8 years, Mr. Thompson trusted her with access to his most sensitive financial information. He trusted her with account codes, authorization credentials, confidential documents. He treated her not just as an employee, but as a member of his professional family. "You're the only family I've really known." Edna's own words echoed in her memory, now twisted into weapons against her. "Order." Judge Patterson's gavel came down hard. "Order in this court." The noise subsided gradually, people settling back into their seats with visible reluctance. Judge Patterson fixed Kelly with a stern look. "Ms. Warren, what you've just done is incredibly disruptive to these proceedings. I should hold you in contempt." "Then hold me in contempt, Your Honor," Kelly said calmly, still moving forward through the courtroom. "But not before you hear what I have to say. Because if you render a verdict without this evidence, you'll be convicting an innocent woman while the real criminal sits free." She stopped in the center aisle, directly between Edna and Wallace's table, and turned to look at Karen Blankenship. "You're good," Kelly said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "I'll give you that. You're very good at what you do. You pick your targets carefully. Powerful men with more ego than sense, companies with complex enough structures that embezzlement can be hidden in the noise. You get close to them, gain their trust, then you set up your theft apparatus." Karen's face remained professionally composed, but something flickered in her eyes. Calculation, fear, rage, Edna couldn't quite tell. "And when someone gets too close to discovering what you're doing, like I did during my divorce, like Edna Hyde did when she noticed irregularities, you frame them first. You use the boss's own paranoia against them. You make the accusation public so they have to support you or look weak. It's brilliant, really. Sociopathic, but brilliant." "Your Honor," Karen stood abruptly. "This is outrageous. This woman is clearly unstable, making wild accusations without any." "Sit down, Ms. Blankenship," Judge Patterson said sharply. "You'll have your chance to respond." She turned back to Kelly. "Ms. Warren, you claim to have evidence?" "I do." Kelly held up the leather portfolio. Financial records showing a pattern of embezzlement from Thompson Enterprises dating back 5 years. Long before Edna Hyde was accused of anything. Records of offshore shell companies established by someone using Wallace Thompson's credentials, but without his knowledge. And most importantly, Kelly pulled out a small flash drive and held it up. "An audio recording from my divorce proceedings, where Wallace Thompson admits, on the record, in front of lawyers, that he routinely authorizes financial transactions using his secretary's credentials without her knowledge or direct involvement." The courtroom erupted again. This time, Judge Patterson didn't even try to quiet them immediately. She was staring at the flash drive with an expression that suggested she understood exactly how significant this was. "Your Honor, this is absurd." Karen's composure was cracking now. This woman is bitter about her divorce. She's clearly trying to hurt Wallace by disrupting these proceedings with fabricated. "They're not fabricated," Wallace's voice cut through the noise, quiet but somehow audible. Everyone turned to look at him. He was staring at Kelly, his face ashen, his hands trembling slightly on the table. "The audio recording. That conversation happened. I remember it." Karen turned to him sharply. "Wallace, don't say anything else. Let me handle." "You told me Edna was guilty," Wallace said, his voice growing stronger. "You showed me the evidence. You said it was clear. You said—" He trailed off, his eyes moving from Karen to Edna to Kelly. "What did you do, Karen?" "I protected you." Karen's voice rose, her professional mask slipping completely. "I protected your company, your reputation, You framed an innocent woman," Kelly said, her voice cutting like a knife. "You stole millions of dollars, and when Edna got close to discovering it, you destroyed her life to cover your tracks." Kelly walked forward to the judge's bench and placed the flash drive and the portfolio on it. "Your Honor, everything you need is here. Financial forensics showing the real destination of the stolen funds. Timeline evidence proving the embezzlement started years before Edna worked on sensitive accounts. Email records showing Karen Blankenship systematically restricting Edna's access and deleting her communications. And the audio recording proving Wallace Thompson has a documented history of using his secretary's credentials without their knowledge." Judge Patterson picked up the flash drive with careful fingers, as if it might explode. "Ms. Blankenship," she said slowly, "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I suggest you think very carefully before you answer. Did you have any involvement in the financial transactions that form the basis of the charges against Ms. Hyde?" Karen stood frozen for a long moment. Edna could see her mind working, calculating odds, looking for an exit strategy. "Your Honor, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," Karen said finally, her voice flat. The courtroom exploded into complete pandemonium. Judge Patterson's gavel came down again and again. "Order. I will clear this courtroom if you cannot maintain order." Edna sat in the center of the storm, tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. Kelly Warren had turned from the judge's bench and was looking directly at her. Their eyes met across the courtroom, Two women who'd never met before this moment, connected by their shared experience of being sacrificed to protect Wallace Thompson's empire. Kelly nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed solidarity, understanding, and a fierce determination that justice would finally be served. Edna nodded back, unable to speak past the sob building in her throat. On the other side of the aisle, Wallace had his head in his hands. Karen stood beside him, her perfect composure shattered, her future collapsing around her in real time. And in the gallery, reporters were typing furiously, cameras were flashing, and Monica Dean was watching everything with the expression of a journalist who knew she was witnessing history. Judge Patterson finally restored enough order to be heard. Given these new developments, I'm declaring a mistrial. The charges against Ms. Hyde are suspended pending a full forensic investigation. Ms. Blankenship, you are not to leave this jurisdiction. Court officers, please escort Ms. Blankenship to a holding room. She'll be questioned by investigators before she leaves this building. Karen's face went white. Your Honor, you can't. I can and I am. Officers. Two court officers moved forward. Karen looked wildly around the courtroom, seeking an escape route that didn't exist. Her eyes landed on Wallace, pleading. He wouldn't look at her. As the officers escorted Karen toward a side door, she passed directly by Edna's bench. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Karen's expression was pure venom, rage at being caught, fury at being exposed, hatred for the woman who'd survived despite her best efforts to destroy her. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a heavy thud that sounded like finality. Judge Patterson turned to Edna. Ms. Hyde, you're free to go. I apologize for what you've endured. The court will be issuing a formal statement once the investigation is complete. Edna tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She sat back down heavily, her whole body shaking with the release of 3 months of terror and desperation. Kelly Warren crossed the courtroom and sat down on the bench beside her. Thank you, Edna whispered. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Don't thank me yet, Kelly said softly. We still have work to do. But you're not alone anymore. You understand. You're not alone. Edna nodded, unable to speak past the tears. In front of them, Wallace slowly stood and turned around. He looked at both of them, his ex-wife who'd just destroyed his reputation to save a stranger, and his former secretary whose life he'd nearly destroyed to save his own image. Kelly, he began, his voice rough. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. Save it, Kelly said coldly. You didn't know because you didn't want to know. Because it was easier to believe Edna was guilty than to question your own judgment. You chose your reputation over her life. Wallace. You don't get to apologize your way out of that. Wallace's face crumpled. He looked like he wanted to say something else, but Kelly had already turned away from him, focusing her attention on Edna. Come on, Kelly said gently, helping Edna to her feet. Let's get you out of here. Together they walked toward the courtroom doors, past the reporters shouting questions, past the spectators staring, past Wallace standing alone with the wreckage of his empire around him. They walked out into the bright afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in 3 months, Edna could breathe. The truth had finally spoken, and it had spoken loud enough to shatter all the lies. The judge's private chambers felt too small for the number of people crammed inside. Judge Patterson sat behind her imposing mahogany desk, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she examined the documents Kelly Warren had provided. To her left stood the court stenographer, fingers poised over her machine to record every word. To her right, a hastily summoned forensic accountant from the district attorney's office leaned over her shoulder, pointing at specific line items in the financial records. Kelly stood on one side of the room, calm and composed despite the chaos she'd unleashed. Edna sat in a chair against the wall, still trembling, Monica Dean beside her with a steadying hand on her shoulder. The reporter had been allowed in at Kelly's insistence. The public has a right to witness this, Kelly had said firmly, and Judge Patterson had reluctantly agreed. On the opposite side of the room, Wallace Thompson stood with his 3 attorneys clustered around him in a protective formation. He looked like a man in shock, his expensive suit somehow seeming ill-fitting now, his confident bearing replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Karen Blankenship sat alone in a chair near the door, a court officer standing behind her. She'd been read her Miranda rights 10 minutes ago. Her lawyer was on his way, but Karen had refused to say anything except to invoke her Fifth Amendment rights. She sat perfectly still, her face a mask of cold fury, watching Kelly Warren with the intensity of someone memorizing an enemy's face. "Your Honor," the forensic accountant said, his finger tapping a document, "these shell company formations match patterns we've seen in other embezzlement cases. Look at the timing. Each one was established within weeks of Ms. Blankenship joining a new company. And the transaction flows." He shook his head. "This is sophisticated. Professional. Someone who's done this before." Judge Patterson looked up at Kelly. "Ms. Warren, you said you had internal emails. I'd like to see those now." Kelly opened her laptop. She'd been allowed to retrieve it from her car, and pulled up a folder. "These are emails I obtained during my divorce proceedings. At the time, I was granted access to Wallace's company email as part of asset discovery. I noticed these exchanges and saved them because they seemed unusual, but I didn't understand their significance until I saw what happened to Edna." She turned the laptop so Judge Patterson could see the screen. "This first one is from Karen Blankenship to Wallace, dated 3 years ago, 2 months after she joined Thompson Enterprises." Judge Patterson read aloud. "Wallace, regarding the offshore restructuring we discussed, I've established the necessary vehicles in the Cayman Islands. For security purposes, I recommend we use layered authorization protocols. This will protect the company's interests and provide plausible deniability if questions arise." She looked up. "Plausible deniability?" "Keep reading," Kelly said quietly. The judge scrolled down. Wallace's response: "I trust your judgment on this, Karen. Set it up however you think best. Just make sure nothing comes back to damage the company's reputation." One of Wallace's attorneys stepped forward. "Your Honor, that email is clearly about legitimate tax optimization strategies. There's nothing illegal about establishing offshore." "Let her finish," Judge Patterson said sharply. Kelly clicked to another email. This one is from 6 months later. "Karen to Wallace. The protocols are working smoothly. I've moved the first phase of funds to the secondary accounts. I'm using rotating authorization codes to maintain security. Your secretary's credentials have been very useful for this. It adds an extra layer of protection for you." The silence in the room was deafening. "And Wallace's response?" Judge Patterson asked, her voice tight. Kelly's expression was grim. He wrote, "Whatever you think is best. I don't need to know the details. Just keep everything clean." Wallace made a sound like he'd been punched. "I didn't. I thought she was talking about legitimate business. I didn't know she was using Edna's." "You didn't want to know," Kelly interrupted, her voice hard. "You wanted plausible deniability, Wallace. Just like Karen offered. You wanted to be able to claim ignorance if anything went wrong." "That's not fair, Kelly. I trusted her professional judgment. You thought you could avoid responsibility by remaining deliberately ignorant," Kelly shot back. "And when things started to unravel, when Edna noticed irregularities and tried to warn you, you chose to believe Karen's story instead of listening to a woman who'd been loyal to you for 8 years. Judge Patterson held up a hand. "Ms. Warren, you mentioned an audio recording?" Kelly pulled the flash drive from her portfolio. "This is from a private settlement conference during my divorce proceedings. It was recorded with everyone's knowledge and consent. Completely legal. May I?" Judge Patterson gestured to her computer. Kelly inserted the flash drive and pulled up an audio file. She clicked play. The sound quality was tinny but clear. Kelly's divorce attorney's voice came through first. "Mr. Thompson, can you explain these specific transactions? Your wife has raised concerns about the authorization protocols being used." Wallace's voice, recorded 3 years ago but unmistakably his. "Sometimes I authorize transfers using different credentials for security purposes. It's a standard practice." The attorney: "But these show your secretary's digital signature." Wallace: "I use my secretary's credentials when I need additional authorization layers. She has my permission, of course. Blanket authorization. It's more efficient than bothering her with every transaction." Kelly's divorce attorney. So to be clear, you've made financial transactions using your secretary's credentials without her direct knowledge or involvement in each specific instance? Wallace. Yes. It's perfectly legal. She authorized me to use her credentials as needed. Use Edna's ID, she'll never question it. That's the kind of trust we have. Kelly paused the recording. The room had gone completely silent. Even the court stenographer had stopped moving, staring at the computer as if it had just spoken in tongues. "Oh my God," Edna whispered from her chair against the wall. "He said my name. He actually said." "He established a pattern," the forensic accountant said slowly, his professional detachment cracking slightly. "A documented pattern of using his secretary's credentials without her specific knowledge. Which means when Karen Blankenship forged transactions using those same credentials, she could point to this pattern and say she was just following established procedures." Judge Patterson removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight of profound disgust. "Mr. Thompson, do you understand what you've done? You created the perfect conditions for someone to frame your employee. You gave Karen Blankenship the tools, the precedent, and the plausible deniability she needed to steal from your company and make it look like Edna Hyde was responsible." Wallace had sunk into a chair, his face in his hands. "I didn't mean. I was trying to be efficient. I trusted Karen to handle things properly. I never thought." "You never thought," Kelly repeated coldly. "That's the problem, Wallace. You never thought about anyone except yourself. You never thought about what would happen to Edna if your system was exploited. You never thought about the consequences of your willful ignorance." One of Wallace's attorneys tried to intervene. "Your Honor, my client clearly had no criminal intent. He was following what he believed to be sound business practices recommended by his legal counsel." "His legal counsel who is currently invoking her Fifth Amendment rights," Judge Patterson interrupted. "The same legal counsel who these emails show was systematically stealing from his company while using his secretary as a shield." She turned to the forensic accountant. "How much are we talking about here? How much was actually stolen?" The accountant flipped through the documents. "Based on these records, conservatively, $7 to $8 million over 3 years. The $2 million Edna Hyde was accused of taking was just the most recent transfer, the one that was big enough and obvious enough that someone finally noticed." Gasps echoed through the small chamber. Even the court officer behind Karen Blankenship looked shocked. Edna made a small, wounded sound. $8 million. She stole $8 million and I was going to go to prison for $2 million I never touched. Monica Dean was scribbling frantically in her notebook, her reporter's instincts overwhelmed by the magnitude of the story unfolding. Judge Patterson stood abruptly. "I'm calling a full recess. I want federal investigators brought in immediately. The district attorney's office needs to begin a criminal investigation into Karen Blankenship for fraud, embezzlement, evidence tampering, and perjury. Mr. Thompson, you're not currently under arrest, but I strongly suggest you cooperate fully with the investigation. If it's determined that you had actual knowledge of these activities, you will face charges." Wallace's head jerked up. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't." "Then you were criminally negligent in your oversight of your own company," Judge Patterson said flatly. "Either way, Mr. Thompson, your problems are just beginning." She turned to Karen. "Ms. Blankenship, you're being detained pending formal charges. You'll be transported to county holding within the hour." Karen finally spoke, her voice venomous. "I want my lawyer. He's on his way. Until then, you don't say another word to anyone." Judge Patterson looked at the court officer. "Get her out of my chambers." As the officer escorted Karen to the door, she turned back one last time. Her eyes found Kelly first, burning with rage, then moved to Edna with something that looked almost like contempt. "You have no idea what you've done," Karen said quietly. "No idea what you've started." "I know exactly what I've started," Kelly replied calmly. "Justice." The door closed behind Karen with a heavy thud. Judge Patterson turned to Edna. "Ms. Hyde, I cannot adequately express the court's regret for what you've endured. A full exoneration will be issued, along with a formal apology. If you choose to pursue civil litigation against Thompson Enterprises or any individuals involved, the court's findings will be made available to support your case." Edna couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We're adjourned," Judge Patterson said. "Everyone out except Ms. Warren. I'd like a word with you privately." The chamber emptied slowly. Wallace's attorneys had to physically support him as they left. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. The forensic accountant gathered his documents, shaking his head with professional disbelief. The stenographer packed up her machine and departed silently. Monica Dean helped Edna to her feet. "Ms. Hyde, I know you've been through hell, but when you're ready, I'd like to do a proper interview. Your story deserves to be told, the real story, not the lies they've been spreading." Edna managed a weak smile. "I'd like that. Thank you for believing something was wrong. For being willing to look past the narrative." "That's my job," Monica said simply. "To find the truth, even when it's buried under lies." They left the chamber together, stepping out into the courthouse hallway where dozens of reporters had gathered, all shouting questions at once. Court officers were trying to maintain order, but it was chaos. Monica shielded Edna with her body, helping her navigate through the crowd. "No comment right now," Monica told the other reporters firmly. "Ms. Hyde will make a statement when she's ready. Give her space." They made it to a small conference room down the hall. Monica closed the door, muffling the noise outside. "Breathe," Monica instructed. "Just breathe. You're safe. It's over." "Is it?" Edna asked, her voice shaky. "Is it really over?" Before Monica could answer, there was a soft knock on the door. Kelly Warren slipped inside, closing it quickly behind her. She looked at Edna for a long moment, then crossed the room and pulled her into an embrace. Edna broke down completely, sobbing into Kelly's shoulder. Great, gasping sobs that seemed to carry 3 months of terror and desperation and helplessness. Kelly held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring softly, I know. Let it out. You're allowed to fall apart now. You held on so long, but you don't have to be strong anymore." They stood like that for several minutes. 2 women who'd been sacrificed to protect a powerful man's empire, finding comfort in shared survival. When Edna finally pulled back, wiping her eyes, Kelly kept a steadying hand on her arm. "Why?" Edna asked. "Why did you do this? You didn't know me. You could have stayed away, stayed safe in your new life. Why risk everything to help me?" Kelly's expression was complex. Sad, determined, and something that looked like hard-won peace. "Because I lived that lie once," she said quietly. "When I was going through my divorce, Wallace's legal team destroyed me. They painted me as unstable, greedy, vindictive. Anything to make me look like the villain so he could look like the victim. And I survived, but barely. And I did it alone, because no one came forward to help me. No one challenged the narrative." She squeezed Edna's arm gently. "I saw your face on the news, and I recognized that look. That expression of someone being destroyed by a system designed to protect powerful people. And I thought, not again. Not to another woman. Not when I have the power to stop it." "You're incredible," Edna whispered. "You're the bravest person I've ever met." Kelly shook her head. "I'm not brave. I'm just tired of watching powerful people destroy innocent lives. I'm tired of women being sacrificed to protect men's reputations. I'm tired of staying silent when silence makes me complicit." She glanced at Monica, who'd been quietly observing. "And I knew I needed help from someone in the media who'd tell the truth rather than just printing whatever Wallace's PR team fed them." Monica nodded. "The truth is about to be everywhere. By tomorrow morning, this will be the lead story in every major outlet. Billionaire's ex-wife exposes corruption. Secretary framed by lawyer's elaborate scheme. The narrative is shifting, Ms. Hyde. Shifting hard. People will believe it now." Edna asked hesitantly. "After months of being told I was guilty?" "They'll believe it," Monica assured her. "Because the evidence is undeniable. Because Kelly Warren has nothing to gain from lying. Because Wallace Thompson's own voice is on that recording, establishing exactly how you were set up. She paused. The court of public opinion is fickle, but it responds to proof. And you now have proof. There was another knock. A court officer opened the door slightly. Ms. Hyde, Judge Patterson would like to see you in her chambers when you're ready. Edna nodded. I'll be right there. The officer left. Edna took a deep breath, steadying herself. Do you want me to come with you? Kelly offered. No. I think I need to do this part myself. Edna managed a real smile for the first time in months. But thank you. For everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't repay me, Kelly said firmly. You live your life. You hold your head high. You don't let what they did to you make you bitter or small. And someday, when you see another woman being destroyed by a system that should protect her, you do what I did, you speak up. You tell the truth. You refuse to be silent. Edna nodded, feeling something solid settling in her chest. Not quite peace yet, but the foundation for it. She left the conference room and walked back toward Judge Patterson's chambers, her steps steadier now. Behind her, Kelly and Monica stood together, watching her go. That was a hell of a thing you did today, Monica said quietly. Kelly smiled slightly. It felt good. It felt right. She paused. I spent 3 years trying to forget Wallace and everything he represented. But maybe the point wasn't to forget. Maybe the point was to remember, so I could make sure it didn't happen to someone else. Well, you just became the most famous ex-wife in America, Monica pointed out. Your phone's probably already exploding with interview requests. I'll talk to you first, Kelly said. Exclusive. Tell the whole story. My divorce, what I discovered, why I came forward. The public deserves to know how these systems work, how powerful people exploit them. Monica pulled out her card. Call me tomorrow. We'll set something up. They shook hands. 2 women who just changed the trajectory of a court case, and possibly a lot more than that. Outside the courthouse, news vans were already setting up. Satellite trucks lined the street. Reporters prepared for live shots, practicing their opening lines about the shocking reversal in the Thompson embezzlement case. The story was breaking wide open, spreading across the internet in real time. Social media exploded with reactions. Shock, outrage, demands for justice, apologies to Edna from people who'd believed she was guilty. The narrative was changing. And deep in the courthouse, in private chambers and conference rooms and holding cells, the machinery of actual justice was finally, belatedly, beginning to turn. 3 weeks after Kelly Warren walked into that courtroom, the final hearing convened. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat in the gallery was filled with reporters, legal observers, Thompson Enterprises employees, and members of the public who'd been following the case since it exploded across every news outlet in the country. Court officers stood at strategic positions, maintaining order in a room that hummed with anticipation. Edna sat at the defense table, though there was no longer anything to defend against. Monica Dean sat beside her, not as a reporter now but as a friend. On Edna's other side sat the attorney Kelly Warren had hired for her, Marcus Chen, one of the top criminal defense lawyers in the state, who'd taken the case pro bono after Kelly had personally called him and explained the situation. You ready? Marcus asked quietly, his hand resting briefly on Edna's shoulder. Edna nodded, though her hands trembled slightly in her lap. I think so. Across the aisle, Wallace Thompson sat with his legal team, but the configuration had changed dramatically. His 3 corporate attorneys had been replaced by criminal defense counsel. Wallace himself looked like he'd lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks. His expensive suit hung loose on his frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. The confident billionaire who'd watched Edna's trial with cold detachment had been replaced by a man who looked haunted. Karen Blankenship sat at a separate table, flanked by her own attorneys and a court officer. She wore an orange jumpsuit. Bail had been denied after prosecutors argued she was a flight risk with the resources to disappear. Her blonde hair, no longer perfectly styled, hung limp around her face. But her eyes were still sharp, still calculating. watching everything with the intensity of someone looking for an escape route. Judge Patterson entered, and everyone rose. She'd requested this consolidated hearing to resolve all outstanding matters at once. The district attorney had brought charges against Karen. The charges against Edna had been formally dismissed, but Patterson wanted a full accounting on the record, a complete exposition of what had happened and who was responsible. "Be seated," Judge Patterson said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 weeks spent reviewing evidence, depositions, and forensic reports. "We're here today to conclude one of the most troubling cases I've encountered in 20 years on the bench. We're here to establish truth, assign responsibility, and deliver justice, albeit delayed justice, to those who've been wronged." She looked down at the documents before her. "I'll begin with the forensic accounting report, as that forms the foundation of everything that follows." A man in a gray suit stood from the prosecutor's table. "Your Honor, Daniel Brooks, Senior Forensic Accountant with the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. I've spent the past 3 weeks examining Thompson Enterprises' financial records, offshore accounts, and transaction histories." "And your findings, Mr. Brooks?" Brooks opened a thick report. "Your Honor, the evidence is conclusive. Between March 2021 and September 2024, approximately $8.4 million was systematically diverted from Thompson Enterprises accounts through a network of shell companies and offshore holdings. The diversions were sophisticated, designed to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems by keeping individual transfers below reporting thresholds." He clicked a remote, and a presentation appeared on screens positioned around the courtroom. Flowcharts showing money moving through various accounts like a river branching into tributaries. The transfers were authorized using rotating digital credentials belonging to various Thompson Enterprises employees, including Edna Hyde. However, our analysis of the authentication logs reveals something crucial. The vast majority of these transactions originated from a single IP address registered to Karen Blankenship's office computer. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Camera shutters clicked rapidly. Brooks continued, his voice clinical and precise. "Furthermore, we conducted a forensic examination of Ms. Hyde's computer and found no evidence of the software necessary to execute these transfers. The prosecution's original claim that Ms. Hyde's computer was the origin point of the transactions was based on forged log files that Ms. Blankenship had administrative access to modify." He turned to look directly at Karen. "In short, Your Honor, Ms. Blankenship created fake evidence to frame Ms. Hyde while conducting the actual theft herself." "What about the documents bearing Ms. Hyde's signature?" Judge Patterson asked. "Forged. We compared them to authentic samples of Ms. Hyde's signature on file with Thompson Enterprises. The pressure points, stroke patterns, and pen lifts are inconsistent. Additionally, metadata from the digital versions of these documents shows they were created on Ms. Blankenship's computer, not Ms. Hyde's." Brooks clicked to another slide showing 2 signatures side by side. One fluid and natural, one slightly mechanical and precise. The forger was skilled, Brooks acknowledged, but not perfect. Under forensic analysis, the forgery becomes apparent. Ms. Hyde never signed these authorization documents. They were fabricated by someone with access to signature samples and digital forgery software. Software we found installed on Ms. Blankenship's personal laptop. Edna closed her eyes, feeling vindication wash over her like a wave. After months of being told she was lying, of having her word doubted, the physical evidence finally proved what she'd known all along. She was innocent. Judge Patterson turned to Karen. "Ms. Blankenship, you've heard this testimony. Your attorney has been provided with the full forensic report. Do you wish to respond?" Karen leaned forward to confer with her lead attorney, an expensive lawyer named Richard Hastings who'd built his career defending white-collar criminals. After a moment, Hastings stood. "Your Honor, while my client disputes some of the interpretations of this evidence, we acknowledge that mistakes were made in the original investigation. However, Ms. Blankenship was acting on information provided to her by Wallace Thompson himself. She was told that Ms. Hyde had authorization to move funds, that the offshore accounts were legitimate company holdings, and that." "That's a lie." The voice came from the other side of the courtroom. Wallace Thompson had stood, his face flushed, his hands gripping the edge of his table. His attorney grabbed his arm. "Wallace, Sit down. Don't say anything. Wallace shook him off. No. I've stayed silent long enough. I let Edna suffer for 3 months because I was too cowardly to admit what I'd done. I'm not staying silent anymore. Judge Patterson leaned forward, her expression intense. Mr. Thompson, I'm going to advise you that anything you say here can be used against you in potential criminal proceedings. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to consult with your attorney before. I don't want to remain silent, Your Honor. Wallace's voice cracked slightly. I need to tell the truth. I need to say what I should have said months ago. His attorney made one more attempt to stop him, but Wallace stepped away from the table, moving to stand in the open space between the defense and prosecution sides. Your Honor, members of the court, everyone who's here today, I owe you the truth. But most of all, I owe it to Edna Hyde. He turned to look at Edna directly for the first time since Kelly had walked into the original courtroom. His eyes were red-rimmed, his expression devastated. Edna, I am so deeply sorry for what I allowed to happen to you. Sorry doesn't begin to cover it. There's no apology adequate for what you've suffered because of my cowardice and my pride. Edna sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Wallace continued, his voice growing stronger. Karen Blankenship approached me 3 years ago with what she called strategic financial restructuring. She told me she could optimize my tax exposure, protect assets from potential litigation, and create more efficient capital flows. She showed me documents, projections, strategies that all seemed legitimate. He paused, swallowing hard. But I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't demand to understand the details. I told her I trusted her judgment, that I didn't need to know the specifics as long as everything was legal and protected the company's reputation. I wanted plausible deniability. The phrase hung in the air like an accusation. Kelly was right when she said I was willfully ignorant, Wallace continued, his voice thick with shame. I chose not to look too closely at what Karen was doing because it was easier. Because it let me focus on the parts of the business I cared about while someone else handled the complicated financial details. And when Edna came to you with concerns? Judge Patterson prompted. Wallace's face crumpled. She came to me 3 times. 3 times, Edna tried to tell me something was wrong with the accounts. That transactions didn't make sense. That she couldn't access files she needed. That Karen seemed to be hiding things. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. And I dismissed her every time. I told her she was mistaken. I told her she was being paranoid. I told her Karen knew what she was doing and to stop questioning it. Why? Judge Patterson asked. Why did you trust Karen Blankenship over an employee who'd been loyal to you for 8 years? Wallace was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was raw with self-loathing. Because Karen told me what I wanted to hear. She made me feel smart, important, in control. She made me believe that I was brilliant enough to have someone like her want to work for me, when really she was using my ego against me. He looked at Edna again. And because when Edna questioned things, it made me feel defensive. It made me feel like she was questioning my judgment, my intelligence. My pride wouldn't allow that. So when Karen accused Edna of embezzlement, Judge Patterson said, "What did you do?" I believed her immediately. Wallace's voice broke. Karen came to me with documents, with evidence, with a complete narrative about how Edna had betrayed me. And instead of investigating thoroughly, instead of demanding independent verification, I let Karen handle it. I let her make the accusation public. I let her destroy Edna's reputation. Why? Because it was easier than admitting I might have been wrong. Because it protected my image as someone who caught a thief rather than someone who was duped by one. Because... He stopped, tears streaming down his face now. Because I valued my reputation more than I valued Edna's life. And that makes me complicit in everything that happened to her. The courtroom was absolutely silent except for the sound of camera shutters and Wallace's ragged breathing. Judge Patterson's expression was stern but not entirely unsympathetic. Mr. Thompson, you understand that this confession may result in criminal charges against you? That you may face prosecution for negligence, for creating the conditions that allowed this fraud to occur, possibly even for conspiracy if prosecutors determine your ignorance was willful enough to constitute knowledge. I understand, Your Honor. Wallace nodded. And I'll accept whatever consequences come. I deserve them. But Edna doesn't deserve what happened to her. She deserves her name cleared publicly, completely, without any shadow of doubt. He turned back to Edna one more time. You told me I was the only family you'd known. You trusted me. You were loyal to me when you had no reason to be, when I'd never given you anything except work and more work, and I repaid that loyalty by throwing you away the moment it was convenient. Edna's eyes were wet, but her voice was steady when she finally spoke. Why are you saying this now, Wallace? Why tell the truth now when it costs you everything? Because Kelly was right, Wallace said simply. Kelly walked into that courtroom and reminded me that truth matters more than image. That people matter more than reputation. That some things can't be fixed by PR campaigns and legal strategies. He wiped his eyes roughly. And because I finally realized that I'd become the kind of man I always claimed to despise, someone who sacrificed others to protect himself. Judge Patterson let the moment breathe, then turned to Karen Blankenship's table. Ms. Blankenship, you've now heard testimony from forensic accountants and a confession from your former employer. Do you wish to make a statement? Karen's attorney started to stand, but Karen put a hand on his arm, stopping him. She stood herself, her orange jumpsuit a stark reminder of how far she'd fallen. Your Honor, I'm not going to insult everyone's intelligence by denying what the evidence clearly shows. Her voice was calm, almost eerily so. Yes, I stole from Thompson Enterprises. Yes, I framed Edna Hyde when she got too close to discovering it. Yes, I manipulated Wallace Thompson into believing my version of events. Her attorney grabbed her arm urgently, trying to get her to stop, but Karen shook him off. I did it because I could. Because the system is designed to let people like me do it. Because powerful men like Wallace Thompson are so easily manipulated by their own egos that they'll believe anything you tell them as long as it makes them feel smart and in control. She looked at Wallace with cold contempt. And because women like Edna Hyde are convenient scapegoats, no one questions it when a secretary gets accused of theft. It fits the narrative people want to believe. So you're confessing? Judge Patterson asked. I'm stating facts. You already have enough evidence to convict me. The forensics prove that conclusively. What I'm saying now won't change my legal situation. Karen smiled slightly, and it was chilling. But I want everyone in this room to understand something. I'm not unique. This happens every day in corporate America. People steal, they frame convenient targets, and the system protects the powerful while destroying the vulnerable. I just got caught. You got caught because Kelly Warren refused to stay silent, Judge Patterson said coldly. Because Edna Hyde refused to plead guilty to something she didn't do. Because there are still people in this world who value truth over convenience. Karen's smile faded. Kelly Warren got lucky. She had resources, time, and evidence I didn't know she'd kept. Most women in her position don't. Most women like Edna Hyde don't survive what I did to them. But I did survive, Edna said quietly, standing to face Karen across the courtroom. Despite everything you did, despite every lie you told, despite the system being stacked against me, I survived. And you didn't win. For the first time, something flickered in Karen's eyes. Not remorse, she seemed incapable of that, but perhaps a grudging respect. No, Karen acknowledged. I didn't win. This time. Judge Patterson's gavel came down hard. Ms. Blankenship, you're hereby remanded to federal custody pending formal sentencing. Based on your confession and the evidence presented, I'm recommending maximum penalties for fraud, embezzlement, evidence tampering, and perjury. You'll be facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Karen's attorneys immediately started making objections, but Karen herself showed no reaction. She simply sat back down, her face empty of expression. Judge Patterson turned to Edna. Ms. Hyde, I want to state clearly and unequivocally for the record. You are completely exonerated of all charges. The accusations against you were baseless, the evidence was fabricated, and you were the victim of a calculated conspiracy to frame you for crimes you did not commit. She paused, her stern expression softening slightly. I wish I could give you back the 3 months of hell you endured. I wish I could erase the damage to your reputation, the trauma you suffered, the fear and desperation you felt. I can't do any of that. What I can do is ensure that this court's findings are made public, that your innocence is established beyond any shadow of doubt, and that you have every legal resource available should you choose to pursue civil remedies against those responsible. Edna nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Furthermore, Judge Patterson continued, I'm ordering Thompson Enterprises to undergo a complete federal audit. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit will conduct a thorough investigation to determine the full extent of the fraud and to ensure no other victims exist. She turned to Wallace. Mr. Thompson, you're not currently facing criminal charges, but that may change depending on what the federal investigation reveals. You're ordered to cooperate fully with investigators. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Wallace said quietly. This case is closed. The gavel came down with finality. We're adjourned. The courtroom exploded into noise, reporters shouting questions, people standing and talking, cameras flashing. But Edna sat perfectly still, letting the reality wash over her. It was over. She was free. Marcus Chen put his hand on her shoulder. Congratulations, Ms. Hyde. Justice isn't always this clear-cut. Savor it. Monica Dean hugged her tightly. You did it. You held on long enough for the truth to catch up. Edna looked across the courtroom one more time. Karen was being escorted out by court officers, her face expressionless. Wallace stood alone, his attorneys clustered in conversation nearby, looking small and broken despite his wealth and power. And in the back of the courtroom, Kelly Warren stood watching with a satisfied expression. When she caught Edna's eye, she nodded once, a gesture of solidarity, of shared victory. Edna nodded back, feeling something settle in her chest that felt almost like peace. The truth had won. Not easily. Not quickly. Not without cost. But it had won. And sometimes, in a world that often seemed designed to protect lies and powerful liars, that was enough. The courthouse steps were bathed in golden afternoon light. Edna stood at the top of the marble staircase, Marcus Chen on one side and Monica Dean on the other, looking down at a sea of reporters, cameras, and microphones. The crowd pressed forward eagerly, everyone shouting questions at once, their voices blending into an incomprehensible roar. Ms. Hyde, how does it feel to be exonerated? What do you want to say to Karen Blankenship? Will you be suing Thompson Enterprises? Do you forgive Wallace Thompson? What are your plans now? Marcus raised his hands, trying to quiet the crowd. Ms. Hyde will make a brief statement. Please hold your questions until she's finished. The noise subsided gradually, cameras focusing, recorders thrust forward on extended poles. Edna could see news vans from every major network lined up along the street. Helicopters circled overhead. This moment would be broadcast across the country, maybe across the world. 3 months ago, these same cameras had captured her being escorted from Thompson Enterprises in handcuffs. Her face stricken, her life in ruins. The images had been replayed endlessly, defining her as a criminal before she'd ever stood trial. Now they were here to capture something different. Redemption. Vindication. Justice. Edna took a breath and stepped forward to the microphones. For 3 months I've been told who I am, she began, her voice quiet but steady. I've been called a thief, a manipulator, a betrayer of trust. My face has been on every screen, my name in every headline, always followed by words like accused, and alleged, and suspected. The world decided who I was before I ever had a chance to speak for myself. She paused, looking out at the crowd of faces watching her. Today the truth came out. Not because the system worked the way it's supposed to, but because people refused to let lies stand unchallenged. Kelly Warren risked her peace to expose corruption. Monica Dean investigated when others simply repeated press releases. Judge Patterson demanded actual justice instead of convenient conclusions. Another pause. Edna's hands were steady now, her voice growing stronger. I didn't do what I was accused of. The evidence proved that conclusively. But more importantly, I never stopped knowing who I was, even when the entire world tried to tell me I was someone else. My mother taught me that. She taught me that your character isn't what people say about you. It's what you know to be true about yourself when everything else is stripped away. She looked directly into the nearest camera. To everyone who believed I was guilty without knowing me, without hearing my side, without questioning the narrative you were fed, I forgive you. You were told a convincing lie by people who are very good at lying. But I hope you'll remember this moment the next time you're quick to judge someone based on headlines and accusations. I hope you'll remember that the truth isn't always convenient or obvious, and that real people's lives are destroyed when we're too willing to believe the worst about each other. A reporter tried to shout a question, but Marcus silenced them with a gesture. I know you want more from me, Edna continued. You want anger, you want drama, you want me to denounce everyone who wronged me. But I'm not going to give you that. Truth doesn't need headlines. Justice doesn't need performance. What happened here today speaks for itself. She stepped back from the microphones. That's all I have to say. The crowd erupted with more questions, but Edna turned and walked back toward the courthouse entrance, Marcus and Monica flanking her protectively. That was perfect, Monica said quietly. Dignified, powerful, and it can't be twisted or sensationalized. I just said what was true, Edna replied simply. As they reached the courthouse doors, a commotion rippled through the crowd behind them. Edna turned to see Wallace Thompson emerging from the building, surrounded by his attorneys and security team. The reporters immediately shifted focus, surging toward him like a wave. Wallace looked directly at Edna across the chaos. He said something to his security team, then broke away from them, walking toward her despite his attorney's protests. The crowd went silent, sensing drama. Wallace stopped a few feet away from Edna, close enough to speak without shouting but far enough to respect her space. He looked exhausted, diminished, nothing like the commanding billionaire who'd once sat in that courtroom watching her suffer. Edna, he said, his voice hoarse. I know anything I say will be inadequate, but I need to say it anyway, publicly, where everyone can hear. He turned slightly so his words would carry to the reporters. I destroyed an innocent woman's life because I was too proud and too cowardly to admit I'd been fooled. I let my ego matter more than the truth. I let my reputation matter more than Edna's future. His voice cracked. There's no apology sufficient for that. There's no redemption that erases it. But I want everyone to know. Edna Hyde is one of the most loyal, honest, hard-working people I've ever known, and everything that happened to her was my fault. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, holding it out to her. This is a check for $5 million. It's not enough, nothing could be enough, but it's a start toward making restitution for what you've lost. Your job, your reputation, 3 months of hell that I put you through. Edna looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she met Wallace's eyes directly. No. The single word fell like a stone into still water. Edna, please. Let me try to make this right. You can't make it right with money, Wallace. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. You can't buy your way out of what you did. You can't write a check and feel absolved. Then what can I do? Wallace asked, and he sounded genuinely desperate. You can live with what you've done, Edna said quietly. You can remember it every time you're tempted to value your image over someone else's life. You can use your power and resources to help other people who've been wrongly accused, who don't have Kelly Warren to save them. You can become someone who deserves the trust that people like me once gave you. She paused, then added with devastating precision, but you can't buy my forgiveness. That's not for sale. Edna turned and walked into the courthouse, leaving Wallace standing on the steps with his uncashed check, his public humiliation, and the weight of his conscience. The reporters erupted with questions, but Wallace just stood there, frozen, as his security team finally pulled him away. Inside the courthouse, in a quiet conference room away from the chaos, Kelly Warren was waiting. She stood when Edna entered, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Two women who'd been strangers 3 weeks ago, now bound by shared trauma and shared triumph. Then Kelly crossed the room and pulled Edna into an embrace. You were magnificent out there, Kelly said. Refusing his money? That was powerful. I didn't do it to be powerful, Edna said, pulling back slightly. I did it because taking his money would have felt like accepting that what happened could be fixed. It can't. I'll carry this for the rest of my life. I know. Kelly's expression was understanding. I've carried my version of it for 3 years. Some wounds don't close completely. They just become part of who you are. They sat down at the conference table, the room quiet and peaceful after the noise outside. What will you do now? Kelly asked. Edna was quiet for a moment. I don't know. I can't go back to Thompson Enterprises. I wouldn't even if they offered. And I don't know if any other company will hire me. My name is still associated with scandal, even if I was proven innocent. Then don't work for anyone else, Kelly said firmly. Start something of your own. Build something that matters. With what resources? I have about $3,000 in savings. That's it. Kelly pulled out her phone and made a few taps, then turned it to show Edna. You have more than that now. I just transferred $200,000 to the account Marcus helped you set up. Consider it seed funding. Edna's eyes widened. Kelly, I can't accept. Yes, you can. And you will. Kelly's tone left no room for argument. I'm wealthy because of my divorce settlement from Wallace. That money came from the same empire that destroyed you. Let me use some of it to help you build something good. Something that helps other women who go through what we went through. What do you mean? A nonprofit, Kelly said, leaning forward with growing enthusiasm. An organization that provides legal support, advocacy, and resources for women who've been falsely accused in workplace situations. Women who don't have the resources to fight back, who don't have Kelly Warren showing up with evidence, who don't have Marcus Chens taking their cases pro bono. Edna felt something stir in her chest, the first real spark of hope she'd felt in months. There are so many Ednas out there, Kelly continued. Women being scapegoated by their employers. Women being framed by people who know how to exploit the system. Women whose word is doubted because they don't have power or money or the right connections. Someone needs to fight for them. And you think I should be that someone? I think you're the perfect person to be that someone. You've lived it. You survived it. You know exactly what it feels like to be trapped in a system designed to protect the powerful. Kelly reached across the table and took Edna's hand. Use that knowledge. Turn your pain into purpose. Help other women the way I helped you. Edna sat with the idea, feeling it take shape in her mind. An organization that provided lawyers to women who couldn't afford them. That investigated workplace fraud and discrimination. That believed women when everyone else doubted them. Truth doesn't need headlines, Edna said quietly. What? That's what I said outside. Truth doesn't need headlines. Maybe that could be the name. An organization dedicated to finding truth when it's buried under lies and power structures. Kelly smiled. That's perfect. Absolutely perfect. They sat together for a while longer, planning, dreaming, building something hopeful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. When they finally stood to leave, Kelly pulled Edna into one more embrace. Thank you, Edna whispered. For everything. For believing me. For fighting for me. For showing me that I don't have to let what happened define who I become. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, Kelly replied. That courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and speaking up anyway. You did that every day for 3 months. You held onto the truth when everyone told you to let it go. That's real courage. They walked out together, leaving through a side entrance to avoid the media circus. Kelly's car was waiting. They said their goodbyes with promises to stay in touch, to work together, to ensure that what they'd started here didn't end with one woman's vindication but became something larger. Edna watched Kelly's car drive away, then stood alone in the quiet side street, feeling the weight of the past 3 months slowly lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't healed yet. She wasn't whole. But she was free, and she was standing, and she had a purpose. That was enough for now. 1 year later. Edna stood in the small office space on Elm Street, looking at the plaque on the door. Truth doesn't need headlines. Advocacy and legal support for falsely accused workers. The office was modest. 3 rooms, second floor of an older building, nothing fancy. But it was hers. And more importantly, it was already making a difference. In the past year, they'd helped 12 women fight false accusations. 8 cases had been resolved in the women's favor. 2 were still pending. 2 had been lost, but even those women said that having someone believe them, having someone fight for them, had made the impossible bearable. Edna had hired 2 staff members, both women who'd been through their own experiences with workplace injustice. They understood on a visceral level why this work mattered. Kelly visited once a month, serving on the nonprofits board and helping with fundraising. She'd convinced several other wealthy women to contribute, building an endowment that would sustain the organization for years. Monica Dean had written a book about the case, Truth on Trial, How One Woman's Courage Exposed Corporate Corruption, and donated all proceeds to the nonprofit. It had become a bestseller, keeping the story alive, educating people about how these systems worked. Wallace Thompson had stepped down as CEO of Thompson Enterprises. The federal investigation had found no criminal wrongdoing on his part. His ignorance had been genuine, though culpable. But the board had pushed him out anyway, unwilling to keep leadership tainted by the scandal. Last Edna had heard, he was working with a foundation focused on corporate ethics reform. She didn't know if it was genuine redemption or image rehabilitation. She decided it wasn't her concern. Karen Blankenship was serving 15 years in federal prison. Her appeals had been denied. She wouldn't be eligible for parole for another decade. Edna walked to her desk and sat down, looking at the stack of case files waiting for her attention. Each folder represented a woman whose life was being destroyed by lies, whose truth was being buried under power and influence. Each folder represented someone she could help. There was a knock on the door. Her assistant, Maya, poked her head in. "Package just arrived for you. Courier delivery." She handed Edna a manila envelope with familiar handwriting on the label. Edna opened it carefully and found a handwritten letter on Kelly's personal stationery. "Dear Edna, I wanted to write this by hand instead of sending another email or text. Some things deserve the permanence of ink on paper. I've been thinking a lot about courage lately, what it means, where it comes from, why some people have it and others don't. I used to think courage was about being fearless, about charging forward without doubt or hesitation. You taught me different. You taught me that real courage is holding on to truth when the entire world is telling you to let it go. It's standing up after being knocked down again and again, even when you have every reason to stay down. It's refusing to let injustice go unchallenged, even when challenging it costs you everything. When I walked into that courtroom a year ago, I thought I was saving you. But really, you saved me. You reminded me that staying silent in the face of injustice makes us complicit in it. You showed me that the peace we build by turning away from other people's suffering isn't real peace. It's just carefully constructed ignorance. What you're building with truth doesn't need headlines matters more than you know. Every woman you help is a woman who doesn't have to fight alone the way we did. Every case you win is proof that the system can be challenged, that power doesn't always win, that truth still matters. Keep fighting, Edna. Keep standing for women who can't stand for themselves. Keep being the voice that refuses to be silenced. You reminded me what courage looks like. Now you're teaching other women the same lesson. Thank you for that. With admiration and solidarity, Kelly." Edna read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in her desk drawer alongside other precious things. Her mother's photograph, her exoneration documents, a thank you note from the first woman they'd successfully helped. She looked out her office window at the city beyond. The same city where she'd once cleaned office buildings with her mother. The same city where she'd worked for 8 years, only to be betrayed. The same city where she'd stood trial for crimes she didn't commit. But also the city where Kelly Warren had walked through courtroom doors carrying truth. The city where Monica Dean had investigated when others simply reported. The city where Judge Patterson had demanded real justice. The city where redemption was possible, even after everything had been taken away. Edna's phone buzzed with a call from a woman whose name she didn't recognize. She answered it, hearing the familiar tremor of fear in the caller's voice, a woman who'd just been accused of something she didn't do, whose employer was moving to destroy her, who'd found Edna's organization through a desperate internet search. "My name is Edna Hyde," Edna said gently. "Tell me what happened. And then let me help you." She listened to the woman's story, took notes, asked questions. When the call ended, she opened a new case file and began documenting everything. Another woman who needed someone to believe her. Another battle against power and lies. Another chance to prove that truth still mattered in a world that often seemed determined to bury it. Edna worked through the afternoon as the sun tracked across the sky. When she finally looked up, golden light was streaming through her office window, painting everything in warm tones. She gathered her things and left the office, locking the door behind her. The building was quiet, most other tenants already gone home. She walked the 6 blocks to the courthouse, the same courthouse where she'd stood trial, where she'd been vindicated, where her life had ended and begun again in the same day. The building was closed now, but Edna climbed the marble steps anyway and sat down halfway up, looking out at the city as the sun set behind the buildings. A year ago she'd stood at the top of these steps, cameras flashing, the world watching, speaking words that came from the deepest part of her. Truth doesn't need headlines. She'd meant it then. She meant it now. The truth of who she was hadn't changed despite 3 months of being told she was someone else. The truth of her innocence had existed even when everyone believed she was guilty. The truth had always been there, waiting to be spoken, waiting to be heard, waiting to be believed. It had just taken time and courage, and people willing to fight for it. Edna sat on the courthouse steps as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. She thought about her mother, about Kendra Hyde who'd cleaned these buildings and taught her daughter that invisible didn't mean powerless. She thought about Kelly Warren, about Monica Dean, about Judge Patterson. She thought about all the women who'd come before her and all the women who'd come after, women fighting battles against systems designed to silence them. She thought about redemption and justice, and the strange ways that our worst moments could become the foundation for our strongest selves. Edna stood finally, as the last light faded from the sky. She descended the courthouse steps, the same steps she'd climbed in handcuffs, the same steps she'd stood on as a free woman, the same steps that had witnessed her destruction and her rebirth. She walked home through the city streets, no longer broken, no longer afraid. Reborn. Ready to help others find their way back to truth, just as others had helped her. The past year had taught her that justice was possible, even when it seemed impossible. That courage could be found even in the darkest moments. That truth, no matter how buried, always found a way to surface. And that sometimes the women who survive the worst injustices become the strongest advocates for justice. Edna Hyde had been destroyed by lies, but she'd been reborn in truth. And now she spent her days ensuring that other women got the same chance she'd been given. The chance to be heard, to be believed, to be vindicated. The chance to transform suffering into purpose. That was her redemption. That was her victory. Not in the courtroom verdict, though that mattered. Not in Karen's imprisonment, though justice required it. Not in Wallace's confession, though truth demanded it. But in every woman she helped. Every life she saved from the same destruction she'd survived. Every time she looked across a desk at someone terrified and alone and said the words she'd once desperately needed to hear. "I believe you. And I'm going to help you fight." That was redemption. That was enough.